It's not been pretty. Okay, we are live.
Okay, welcome everyone. The June 8th, 2023 regular council meeting is called to order at 4 o'clock. Council would like to acknowledge the Ucluelet on whose traditional territories the District of Ucluelet operates. Audience members and delegates are advised that this proceeding is being video recorded and broadcast on YouTube and Zoom, which may store data on foreign servers. Are there any late items? Seeing none, the applicant has requested that item 8.1, rezoning application 23-04, 1634 Larch Road be removed so they can submit different plans and the proposed bylaw can be changed. May I have a motion to delete item 8.1 and renumber the agenda accordingly?
So moved.
Councillor Anderson,
Second.
Councillor Kennington, all in favor? None opposed, and that carries. We have two sets of minutes for adoption today. The first are from the May 9th, 2023 regular council meetings.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, don't we need to adopt the agenda with that amendment?
Yes, you're right. May I have a motion to approve the June 8th, 2023 regular council meeting agenda as amended?
So moved.
Councillor Hoare, Councillor Mafty, all in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Thank you for that. The first set of minutes are from the May 9th, 2023 regular council meeting. Any errors or omissions? May I have a motion to adopt the minutes as presented?
So moved.
Councillor Hoare,
I'll second.
Councillor Anderson, all in favor? None opposed, and that carries. The second set of minutes is from the May 16th, 2023 special council meeting. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, may I have a motion to adopt the minutes as presented?
So moved.
Councillor Mafty,
Second.
Councillor Kennington, all in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Delegations. We have a delegation this afternoon from Surfrider Pacific Rim. And I understand they are here in person. Please limit your presentation to 10 minutes and present from the mic.
I wanted to start by saying Happy World's Ocean Day, everyone. My name is Sophie Peters. I'm the chapter coordinator at Surfrider Pacific Rim. And the following presentation is to address the Surfrider Foundation Canada Pacific Rim chapter's Take Back the Tap campaign, an objective of adding single-use plastic water bottles 1 liter and under to the single-use plastic regulation bylaws. I will start off by quickly introducing our organization. We are the Surfrider Pacific Rim chapter, and our mission is the protection and enjoyment of the ocean, waves, and beaches for all people through a powerful activist network which spans internationally. Our chapter engages in 3 pillars of focus, the first being ending plastic pollution, the second, implementing circular solutions for local waste, and the third, engaging youth, individuals, businesses, and government in ocean-friendly initiatives. Joey, I think. Thank you. Okay.
How do you, just while we're waiting, how do you differentiate between youth and individuals? Presumably that was a deliberate choice.
Oh, just because we have specific youth programming and then also engage with the general public as well.
Gotcha.
Thank you. Thanks to your leadership and support of our progressive community, in June 2019, you implemented the single-use plastics regulation and a bylaw banning plastic straws and plastic bags in Tofino and Ucluelet, which Surfrider Pacific Rim assisted with. Following our Straws Suck and Ban the Bag victories, collaborative efforts between District of Ucluelet, the District of Tofino, and Surfrider have further led to the additions of polystyrene takeaway containers in 2020 and plastic cutlery in 2022 to the single-use plastics regulation bylaws. Building on the success of our collaborative action, we're continuing to work with local businesses and governments to present better alternatives to single-use plastic water bottles and add this item to the District of Ucluelet and District of Tofino's single-use plastic regulation bylaws, continuing this momentum that we've generated together over the past 4 years. As you can see on the slide above, Ucluelet and Tofino have remained frontrunners in the province of BC and across Canada for addressing the plastics crisis at the municipal level, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. In 2022, Canada's single-use plastic ban was implemented at the federal level, prohibiting several plastic items that are commonly discarded after single use. This included plastic bags, straws, stir sticks, six-pack rings, cutlery, and expanded polystyrene foam takeout containers. The implementation of this ban at the national level is the exact reason why it is our responsibility to keep pushing to eliminate the remaining single-use plastics at the municipal level and continue to lead by example for other coastal communities, the province, and the Canadian nation state. Oh. According to a report from Ocean Legacy Foundation, more than 1 million single-use plastic bottles go missing a day. So correction from the slide there. In the province of BC alone. This came from the staggering statistic of 1.6 billion single-use plastic water bottles going missing over a 5-year span. It is estimated in North America that 60 to 70% of plastic water bottles are sold are not recycled and end up in landfills and our waterways. Once in our waterways and the marine environment, these water bottles break down into microplastics, posing serious health consequences to marine life at every trophic level. Marine debris poses risk to wildlife entanglement or ingestion, which can have fatal consequences. Also, once ingested, these microplastics become embedded in the food chain, which not only impacts marine life and terrestrial wildlife, but humans as well. In more recent years, scientists have begun detecting microplastics in humans, including in our lung tissue, placentas, breast milk, and feces. Last year, for the first time ever, microplastics have become detectable in our bloodstreams. The most common type of plastic polymer detected is polyethylene, PET, which is also used to make single-use plastic water bottles. These same polymers can also be regularly found in fruits, fish, drinking water, and many substances we regularly ingest. In collaboration with Tloquet Tribal Parks, Surfrider Pacific Rim launched a campaign in 2018 to eliminate single-use plastic water bottles, 1 liter and under, from the Pacific Rim. Since then, we have installed 2 water refill stations in the District of Tofino with educational signage and supported the installation of Classic Plastic, a circular economy sculpture created by Pete Clarkson, inspired by the Take Back the Tap campaign. We have also received a letter of support for the Take Back the Tap campaign from Tokwat First Nation and have commenced engagement with Ucluelet First Nation, Heshquit First Nation, and Ahousaht First Nation. This has consisted of providing information on the campaign with allocated funding available for engagement, as well as providing a briefing note to the Ucluelet First Nation for review. Since 2018, Through a variety of remote shoreline cleanups, community cleanups, and local beach cleanups, the Surfrider Pacific Rim chapter has removed more than 50,000 plastic single-use water bottles in collaborative efforts with local First Nations and other coastal groups from the local coastlines. Since the launch of the Take Back the Tap campaign, we have contacted 137 businesses between the District of Tofino and District of Ucluelet, asking if they support the campaign's call to action, a ban on single-use plastic water bottles 1 liter and under. A total of 84% of contacted businesses are in support of the campaign and have signed the Take Back the Tap pledge. Of the 16% not in support of the campaign, the majority of those businesses did not reply to our outreach efforts. Only 7 businesses between Tofino and Ucluelet were found to be non-compliant with the campaign. Throughout the summer, Surfrider Pacific Rim volunteers will continue to communicate with local businesses and present alternatives for single-use plastic water bottles, such as reusable water bottles, aluminum water bottles, or plastic bottles sizes larger than a liter. Through our work campaigning to eliminate single-use plastics on the West Coast, we've realized there are 2 key components for creating systematic change on the local level. Firstly, this requires shifting the culture. Through all of our campaigns, including Take Back the Tap, we have worked creatively and collaboratively to build voluntary compliance amongst business communities. We have also made sure to bring everyone along in our efforts. So being inclusive and listening to the challenges businesses may be facing and helping them to troubleshoot these challenges. Secondly, this involves shifting regulations and policy, which entrenches this cultural change for the long term and can influence other locales for years to come. This also makes it possible for Surfrider to continue campaigning, which is the essence of the organization, and not what some have called us, the plastic police. This means making zero waste the norm, promoting business champions, educating community and visitors, restoring the local environment from plastic pollution, and working with local governments to have this reflected in bylaws. Through these actions, we affirm people's sense of worth and identity as it relates to environmental protection and stewardship. By adding plastic water bottles 1 liter and under to the single-use plastics regulation bylaws, together we can start to tackle one of the most prevalent plastic pollutants on the coast and continue to be a leader for coastal communities across the province. On behalf of the Surfrider Pacific Rim chapter, we thank you very much for listening to our call to action today and are happy to answer any questions you may have or listen to any additional feedback from the district.
Thank you, Sophie. That was a great presentation. A little scary that microplastics are being found in our bodies, though. That I did not know. Any questions for Sophie? Councillor Hoare?
My concern about this, because I see this problem at work every day, is in Ucluelet we don't have enough refill stations. So I know that the co-op hasn't got theirs installed because we ran into a problem with the water line. But I'm wondering what the plan is to, do the district's supposed to be installing one, I believe, and I'm just wondering what the plan is there, because I know that a lot of tourists are coming into businesses going, can you refill my water bottle? And I know Heather Grimshire at the coffee bar, right? They get it all the time and they don't have time to do that. So more refill stations would be a bonus. So.
Yes, I agree. And that's something that the work we want to continue to do, even if this bylaw came into place. Even this year, we've applied for grants to fund more refill stations in both districts, and we will continue to look for those funding opportunities as well. Also, in terms of a lot of the businesses we've consulted with, especially regarding adventure tourism groups, which are taking people out on trips, a lot of them are in agreement to filling people's water bottles for them at their workplace. So I think that would also continue to be a key element in business engagement and education as well.
I had a couple of questions. Of the 7 businesses that are non-compliant, did they give reasons why?
Most of those businesses just wanted full confirmation from all local First Nations to make sure that this wouldn't be impacting. Based on the consultation so far, we have full support from Tloquet First Nation and Tokwat First Nation. We've also engaged with Ucluelet First Nation, and they're currently reviewing all the information, and we'll continue those engagement processes as well throughout the summer before we bring this delegation to the District of Tofino as well.
Great, thank you. And where do you send the plastic bottles that you collect?
So we bring them to the Ocean Plastic Depot, which is up at the landfill, and their Ocean Legacy takes care of those water bottles. So those water bottles get sent to their Richmond facility, where they process a variety of different marine debris and recycle it, and it also goes to their data as well on marine debris that's being found in the environment.
Great, thank you. I think, is that the same group that recycles old fish nets?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Anderson?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, great presentation, Sophie. Yeah, I fully support that. And yeah, I know it's a difficult thing to bring around, but I think that's the direction that we're all going. And I know that there's a refill station at Wickaninish Beach now. So I think the federal parks have installed some of those refill stations. So yeah, great work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Is there any unfinished business? Seeing none, our next item is a committee of the whole item. I would like to move that council go into a committee of the whole meeting. May I have a seconder?
I'll second.
Councillor Hoare. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Our only committee of the whole item is, and you guys don't have to stay for the whole meeting if you don't want to.
Run away.
4 more hours.
Our only item is 7.1, Growth Analysis and Options Revisited. This report will be presented by the Director of Community Planning, Mr. Gregg. Welcome. I thought you were on holidays.
I am.
Can't you tell?
Thank you. Council had expressed interest in having a sort of a revisit to the discussion that had happened November 2021, I believe, was when we did some analysis in response to a request from council to look at how some of the growth scenarios that had been projected in the land use demand study that we had done would relate to the official community plan. That discussion really hadn't been part of the update and review up to that point. So we went through this analysis, and so I'll go through it. There's a lot of information in your agenda. I won't maybe spend as much time on it as we did originally, but because I want to leave lots of time for discussion and questions. Next slide, please. So these slides were from that November 23rd, 2021 committee of the whole meeting, and it looked at some analysis and had some questions around whether we wanted to make amendments, which ultimately council did decide to amend the draft plan and as a result of that discussion. Next slide, please. So the analysis sort of had a snapshot of where Ucluelet is in terms of the number of tourist accommodation and residential properties within the community. And I talked a bit about the assumptions behind the analysis, and then looked at the different scenarios, which were really sort of basic, some different paths, some projections, and say how might those play out given some policy choices. Next slide, please. Okay. These are in a slightly different order than the notes from 18 months ago, so we'll wing it slightly in the timing of this. So this is the land use demand study had looked at provincial, federal census data and projections of population growth, and this was in conjunction with Tofino, so looking at the whole West Coast as well. We had participation from the Indigenous communities on the West Coast, and so there was Ucluelet specific information, but really looking at what are all the sort of background factors affecting growth and demand, and looking at industrial uses and commercial uses and tourist accommodation. And so it said, well, depending on who you're looking at and the assumptions, if you're looking out 30 years into the future, or more, it it could go in different directions. So this was looking at this slide is really taking out of that study their projections, which are based on a bunch of different data sources for what some different scenarios of low, medium, and high growth on the West Coast might be in terms of what sort of household growth there would be. They also concluded and looked at what sort of tourist visitor rates and accommodation, and essentially one of the conclusions of the study was essentially there's an almost unlimited appetite for tourist accommodation, but then they were looking at obviously there's some limits to the supply of that, but looking at what is the permanent population, the housing need that comes out of that as well. Next slide, please. And one more. There were some beautiful pictures from Russell Roper in this slide deck, which were reminders to me to pause for questions. So if you see a beautiful picture of the area, it's a good time to jump in with questions. So this was part of the snapshot of where town is now. So the map really is showing with all the different colors, the land uses, and really what is built out. We went through literally parcel by parcel to kind of take out the vacant lands, which are white or colorless, and looked at what's developed and what the difference is. So the snapshot is that today we have roughly an equal number of housing and tourist accommodation units, and obviously and a few years ago, like around 2015, 2016, that was a little different balance. It was about 60-40 in terms of accommodation versus tourist housing versus tourist accommodation. Right, we're about equal, 50-50. And obviously we're feeling some pressures in our housing supply. And we had the graph here. The one on the left was looking at the average cost of residential units versus wages. So you can see those diverge. And this, again, was picked up in the housing needs assessment, the housing demand study that was done by McCullough for us around the same time as well, where they were saying around 2016 things start to diverge. And so that graph on the left sort of shows where the average household income was very close to what was the average value of a home, where we went from housing being valued for, or homes being valued for the housing value versus some new interest coming in. And that very closely corresponds with growth in Airbnb units in town as well. So, and then on the right, the graph, there are really, it's looking at 814 permanent households and 850 units of tourist accommodation. So very, very closely matched. So the yellow and orange graphs, they're all the various types of housing units. And then the blue little graph is the vacant lots, and then the pink stuff is the different forms of tourist accommodation. Next slide, please. And one more. And this really was focusing on the growth of short-term rentals. And the graph in the upper right corner was the B&B business licenses being established and the year that they were established. And so that shows really clearly that the B&B use really was something that was in the background. It was a low impact until around 2016. Just that's when it sort of got on the map. And at that time there were 94 total. Now we have I think 120 licensed B&Bs in town. And so one of the assumptions around the growth analysis, I think this is key, is that all the scenarios were making the assumption that there would be a stop to the further endless, kind of adding B&Bs in residential areas, because all of the scenarios, it's really that balance between tourist accommodation and housing. You have it's really trade-offs. And so not to say that you couldn't have more B&Bs, it was really, but in terms of the numbers, if we're going to have B&Bs be the form of tourist accommodation, then to have the same result, you have to be dialing back on other types of tourist accommodation. And those other types of tourist accommodation show up in our zoning and our land use maps as future hotels or expansion or growth of existing businesses as well. So that was one of the main sort of assumptions. There was some discussion around that at the time. Next slide, please. So the scenarios that we looked at, it really was we looked at sort of growth if there nothing changed. What sort of the projecting out the current trends, but also looking at if you aimed for a balance between housing and tourist accommodation to be back more towards the 60-40, where you had more housing and presumably that resulting in less of the pressure that the community is experiencing now, relative to the amount of tourist accommodation, that would be a positive. And so it looked at, okay, depending on the outcomes that the land use study projected, what would the numbers be in terms of numbers of housing units versus number of accommodation units. And I think one of the assumptions there also, I just point out at the bottom there, it talks about the sort of densities in the land areas. We weren't assuming anything radical, like suddenly there's going to be, towers and really, really high urban densities. That all of the projections were based on relatively the same kind of pattern of density as, single family lots being roughly the mix of what we have in town, and multifamily being roughly the same intensity of land uses. And same with sort of the cabins and hotels and tourist accommodation, not being a radical change in the type of it. Next, please. And again. So the scenario that looked out as just sort of building out what was sort of already on the books really showed I think we can just sort of skip to the next slide, which I think just adds a layer to this one. Oh, that was sort of the takeaway. That essentially it would lead to that balance worsening, not getting better. That we had sort of in terms of the amount of residential land designated versus the amount of tourist accommodation and some of the growth and expansion of that, the end result would be, sort of we're on the path to what we've seen in the last few years where we seem to have more tourist accommodation and less housing relative to that. So, so even without having more B&Bs added to it, we'd still have the pressure of trying to balance how do we get enough housing to make sure we have enough workers housed and sort of improve the quality of life of the people in the community who are facing housing challenges. Next slide, please. And so then we started looking at some of the projections from the land use study. And so this took, if there was this took the low residential growth projection or scenario from the land use study and say, okay, if you took that and you got back to a balance of 60-40 in terms of housing to accommodation, how much tourist accommodation could occur. And really the result of that, next slide please, was you would have to really seriously limit the development of new tourist accommodation, because if you have low residential growth, we already have an imbalance. So it would mean some very tough choices. And I would just point out the implication of that. So in sort of the lower left where there's red and yellow and blue, I should actually point if I have a pointer, down this area. So this is Weyerhaeuser's lands. So they're sort of future next phases. So really note that there isn't hotels in that area, where in the past they've always planned and their zoning was showing that they would have one or two hotels and some tourist accommodation. It would take that kind of tough decision around, if we're around limiting that accommodation growth in order to get that balance. Next slide, please. So this took, the medium growth scenario, if you will. It really looked at low tourist accommodation growth out of the land use demand study, but still getting that 60-40 balance of housing. So low tourist accommodation would also need to have a bunch of housing to catch up, if you will. Overall, then having what we referred to as the medium scenario. So 1.8% growth over 30 years, which is, similar to what we have been seeing, only, there's always ups and downs in growth. You have low times and high times. It's been fairly busy in the last few years. And so this sort of medium growth scenario is actually sort of, if that were to continue over 30 years pretty consistently, that's a lot of growth. And so that would bring the permanent population in 2050 to around 3,100. So some expansion of towns, certainly, but this still was looking at, okay, how much land then needs to be allotted for residential and versus tourist accommodation uses. So here in the areas like in the Weyerhaeuser lands, that there were some accommodation being sort of laid out, and there were assumptions around that there would be some more tourist accommodation in those areas. Next slide, please. And so really, I guess again here the takeaway: if you had, even with low tourist accommodation, we would need to add a substantial new supply of housing. So that would lead to the overall medium rate of growth because of that sort of housing catch-up portion. Next slide, please. And then this was saying, okay, if you had medium tourist accommodation as projected in the land use study, and you're hitting that 60-40 balance, well, then what does that look like? And really, it's that the more tourist accommodation, the more housing you need, plus the deficit you're already in to get to 60-40. It meant 5% growth over the next 30 years, annual growth. 2050 permanent population of 4,900 people, so substantial growth in town to serve that larger economy and a larger tourist economy and all that tourist accommodation. So, and really what this high growth scenario showed, so it's pretty substantially building out town. That largely is what had been in the OCP land use plan, really in the 2011 plan. So those are the areas of land that were being designated for that. Was, if not changed or checked, could result in that kind of high growth. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was looking at roughly 90 homes per year. Here we are on the table. So as part of the land use study, it did also look in some detail at each of those scenarios and what's the servicing, what's the infrastructure required to service those areas. Next slide, please. In terms of the cost of water, sewer, roads as it expanded. Now some of that, or a lot of it would be presumably, if the municipality if we're doing our job right, most of that would be paid for by developers as they're developing with new subdivisions and whatnot, but it still becomes infrastructure that ultimately is operated and maintained and replaced by the municipality. So there's a balance of, what are all your assets and your total tax base, and those get into sort of higher level discussions. But it really looked at what's the efficiency and the cost of, the initial lower level of growth being very much within what is pretty much the existing serviced area with some minor expansion on the edges, but really within the serviced area of what's within town. And then looking as the colors that show here that relate to those infrastructure costs as sort of going out into different areas that there's costs associated. The costs get higher the further you go out. And so there was some thought around, are you infilling and densifying what's here versus adding to the size of the infrastructure asset base of the town? Next slide, please. So, some of the takeaways that really with every tourist accommodation unit, it adds, it compounds the housing challenges because you have a bigger workforce. And so you need not just to house the people who currently are facing challenges, but need to be catching up. And also within the note that on second homes, we had some pretty good data out of the land use study that second homes are kind of, they're not tourist accommodation in the same way as a hotel room, but they're not housing a Ucluelet permanent resident, but they do sort of take up a certain amount of the supply. So we had factored that in. I guess what this is saying is that we had accounted for the numbers of what was sort of expected current and some growth in that, and that was pretty clearly projected from the land use study. And really the note then is building new housing supply isn't really just enough for the answer. It's making sure we get the right kinds of housing that we're focusing on, trying to diversify and get housing that is attainable by Ucluelet residents. And again, that in all of these scenarios that they were based on looking at lands that are designated for tourist accommodation and not accounting for as well growth in the number of bed and breakfasts as the accessory use within the residential zones. That the residential lands were sort of saying, okay, that's a residential part of the balance. And as you're all aware, there were then some changes to the B&B regulations that council enacted last year, which has, I think, slowed down the proliferation, but it is still growing. It is still an allowed use within our zoning. Next slide, please. So after that analysis, there were some questions for council. Again, this was the draft land use plan, which was showing a lot more detail, but largely the pattern of what had been in the comprehensive development zones in the former forest reserve lands, so on the Windansea lands and the Weyerhaeuser lands, of what they had shown. And so then the question of where do you want to go was put to council. And really the lowest growth scenario was what was discussed. Wasn't quite low, wasn't quite medium, somewhere in there. And we went back and looked at that. Next slide, please. And there we are, sort of highlighted there. So it was, somewhere between the low and the medium. So about 2,600 was projected as that 2050 permanent population. It's about 1% per year over the next 30 years on average. And still hitting that 60-40 housing touristic accommodation ratio was seen to be what was sort of the kind of comfortable projection. Again, this isn't, these are projections and has influenced the areas of land shown in the land use plan in the OCP. So that really policy is around modest development of new tourist accommodation, prioritizing developing new housing for residents, and there were some areas designated as being outside of the current OCP, so that up until about 2050 range, potential future development, but not seen as really coming into play in the next 30 years. Next slide, please. So this was the lowest growth scenario. So that there were certainly are areas where there is new tourist accommodation in some spots. Looking at sort of the balance of densities, allowing for some infill. And then next slide, please. I think it sort of translates it into, this is the land use plan that ultimately is very similar to the final plan that was adopted in the OCP that's in the current plan now. So I'd point out some of these gray areas here. That's earmarked. There's a new policy in the OCP talking about that as future growth potential, but not in the current plan, if you will. Next slide, please. I think that may be it for slides. And so I would just see, are there, I'll pause and see if there's any questions about all of that past work, I guess. We'll start there.
Questions from council? Councillor Anderson?
All right, thank you for that. And through the mayor, there was a lot to digest there when going through the what you gave us. It's a lot to take in. I had just looking at that, I was wondering how, our neighbors to the north there in Tofino, do you know what their ratio or what their ratio is right now for a resident to tourism roughly?
Oh, that's a really excellent question. I don't know. I think we could find that out. Whether they have done a similar analysis following, like we worked together on the land use demand study. So that we had a lot of the snapshot of, okay, what's here today, whether they've sort of taken it to a more fine grain to be able to say, what's that ratio at? These things, and I think if you read in the attachments or the appendix was that analysis. It includes this whole couple sheets of footnotes where we're just trying to give every caveat possible to say, look, this is projections. This isn't,
right.
The science of exactly the numbers, and it's always a bit of comparing apples to oranges a little bit, partly because it's hard to get real clear hard numbers when you're looking at census data versus BC assessment. It's all a little different.
Yeah.
But no. So to answer your question, I don't know exactly what their ratio is. Nor we looked around at the time trying to find like the Whistler Center for Sustainability. Some folks do some great consulting work there. We asked them, hey, are you aware of? Has anyone done research on? Is there sort of a perfect balance or a healthy balance? Is there a point at which that ratio becomes alarming that, you're only at 50-50 and what should that be? And they said, well, that would be a great thesis for somebody, but no, as far as we know, nobody's done that.
Right.
So, I mean, really what we're looking at is, okay, what do we have today, which is about 50-50 or probably worse. And if you go back a little ways to when you didn't have maybe some of the same pressures on housing, what was that starting to look like? And because there's some real obvious changes in demand and changes in how people have been using land that are really within the last 10 years. So
Right.
sort of looking at that and going, okay, well, so the 60-40 is not, well, that is the magic answer. It's just, again, a projection, but sort of based on what was in the recent memory, I guess, of the town.
Right. I see that as being somewhat sort of abstract, but yeah, I guess as thinking as maybe a cautionary tale, because Tofino's probably gone through some of these things, like what their growth rate's been in the last 5 years, or even just the number of secondary homes that people would have, which is tough on the census as well. But to figure out maybe like, okay, what would be the ramifications of some of those things, or have, second homes instead of having affordable or attainable, you know what I mean? Because then that shifts the population in that way too.
Yeah.
So I realize how complex this is and all the different sources that you're using, but I guess I saw the lowish growth strategy, and which seems to make sense, and medium as well to me, just going through it. I mean, but if you did lowish and you continued on that, in your opinion, in the next, like, say 5 years, do you have any ramifications to that you think would be negative, like with doing lowish?
Well, okay, how to get into this and explain it. It's not like we have a throttle that clearly is like, okay, slow down, developers, and slow down. We're gonna dial it up and dial it down. So many individual decisions by landowners add up and affect what was growth this year. Who pulled a building permit, what got built. We don't control that. What I think the municipality or all local governments have is, how do your bylaws and regulations set the context for that? And then how do people, something's happening, we tend to adjust the regulations. So it's not like, our projection is we're going to have 24 building permits for residences this year, and if you're number 25, sorry, wait in line, we won't issue it until next January. That does not happen. That's not how it works. So these are scenarios we're projecting, going, what if? So, and again, looking over like a 30-year span is what we're trying to do, realizing that economies go up and down, the rate of development tends to go up and down in a cycle. So, what we're experiencing now is higher than that lowish growth scenario. That's what we've been seeing for the last few years. If it were to keep going at that rate, by the year 2050, it will be a different result than what we're showing in that lowish growth scenario. But, we don't have a crystal ball on what it's going to be next year. It could slow down with higher interest rates. It could, so on average, though, you're going to have some busier times, some lower times. I guess the comment being that the fact that the number of building permits, the amount of development we've been seeing is higher than that sort of scenario that was endorsed in the OCP isn't, I think, a cause for alarm necessarily, but it's something to watch. And that really for council, it starts to and should inform individual decisions on if someone's coming forward and saying, well, let's build a lot more tourist accommodation, or let's build a whole lot more housing. It's a good sort of touch point of saying, well, okay, are we following what we were trying to achieve as we ask questions or approve what is allowed to be developed? Those add up and affect that, if you will. Does that help put in context? It's kind of a fuzzy thing. It's not as much like we have this projection, therefore that's how it will unfold. Where no, it doesn't work as precisely as that.
Right. Cool. Thanks.
In your next report, you have a sentence that I really like. It says, growth does not historically proceed in a linear manner. More typical is an oscillating pattern of rapid cycles and slow cycles. That really kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah. And we've been, I think in Ucluelet, if you sort of look, another graph we could throw up there is leading up to about 2008, things were fairly busy and then got very quiet for a number of years. And every community kind of sees these things that happen. Market change in the U.S. affected that one, and all kinds of things. And how it affected different communities, plays out in different ways. Since about 2015 in Ucluelet, that's been building and building. And, in the pandemic, we thought, there it goes, it's going to slow right down. We were all wrong about that. It actually has fueled things, if anything. So who knows where it's sort of going, but I think it's having the policies that resulted from that analysis, though. And one of the things that council adopted is saying, hey, for any major development, we should aim for a target of at least 75% of the housing being attainable to Ucluelet households. That's a strong statement, and so that starts to affect things like, we've seen some applications like the Monado Bay development. there's arguably 78% of that is attainable to equivalent households, the way they've structured that. So if you continue to, sort of follow that policy, that can affect the type of housing, may also affect, though not as directly, it may affect the numbers too. But ultimately it's sort of the OCP is there. It's also why an OCP, here's a plug for, it's a work in progress. It's a working plan that it's a bylaw that's adopted. The decisions of council should be following that, but it can be amended, and it's normal and healthy to amend it from time to time. Because if you're tracking it and over a few years, it's like, hey, we want to tweak or adjust something because it better suits the community than it should be.
So that medium rare option that we chose from your menu back in 2021, we're really not there, are we? We're kind of more medium for growth.
For what we're experiencing right now, yes. But so that would be how I would describe that to someone is saying the official community plan adopted by council after lots of discussion and community input is a plan for what the community sees as playing out and hoping to see over the next 30 years, trying to look long term. So we may currently have more than that, because we may have less at some point as well. But so if we continue to see this sort of sustained higher growth than that rate is, then at some point in the next while, it may be like, hey, do we need to rethink this? Do we have the door too wide open? Are we going to overshoot what we're comfortable with? Or are we going to get to sort of a more or less built-out state sooner rather than later, and then things will slow down? One of the things is, depending on how much land is zoned for certain uses, if it becomes decisions of council of, hey, we're rezoning a property and allowing more density, more growth on it, that's the most direct control that in terms of land uses. Okay, what's on the books, if you will, that people could put their property to use for.
Any other questions from councillors?
Yeah, just curious. The existing OCP and zoning, everything's sort of allotted. It's zoned, and all of those zones have FAR and coverage and density regulations. If nobody went for rezoning and everybody did exactly what they were allowed to do, what's the existing OCP and zoning, what growth scenario would that be in?
Oh, good question. To add up what would essentially what it would build out be given the existing zoning today.
No rezonings.
No rezonings today. It would be, again, the growth scenarios, there was a rate of growth component of that. And so some of that is like, do you hit build out on year 10 or year 30 of your plan, I guess, is so right now we're on track we'd be hitting build out sooner than we projected. Yeah. But I'm not going to give you a number because we have to do some counting. I think it would be where. Sorry, I want to give you a simple, clear answer, but there's a whole lot of it depends that factors into this, because there are lands that are zoned for units and for uses, but have a number of steps to get to before they could actually put to that use. I'm thinking such as like Weyerhaeuser's land, which has development permits, subdivision. Those lots don't exist yet. So if it were on existing lots, I'm going to give myself a caveat here. If it were on existing lots, essentially it's that low growth scenario is what would play out if you essentially built out what are the existing lots under the existing zoning in town without approving any more development permits or subdivision. So if you have a landowner who's got, I'm zoned for more density and more units, but I need to just get a DP and go through subdivision, to some extent that's the zoning sets up that expectation, but there's still a lot of details to get through to get to that point.
I'm just trying to get a handle on, when people come in front of us and they're seeking a rezoning that may add density, like what's our budget for, on an ongoing basis? Like, do we have to really consider each one exclusive of the others, or,
Yes and no. It's because it's not like it's going to have a profound, black and white breaks the town if you approve one more unit over there. But with each of those applications, say for an undeveloped piece of property that's zoned for fairly low density, if they want to come in and and do higher density, it's worth keeping in mind though. Okay, if you say yes to that one, does it affect the balance? Maybe it affects it in a positive way. Maybe it's, hey, there's even more housing of the right type coming in, and so good. That's adding housing that a Ucluelet resident needs is growth, and so arguably that's a positive thing for the community, or more positive than maybe another type of development, or more positive than not having a housing unit and somebody living in a van or substandard housing conditions. So it's hard to give a simple answer to that one, but I think it's if you thinking of it as a balance though, of trying to achieve a healthier balance between the tourist accommodation and needed housing for residents, is probably a good framework to keep in the back of our minds for all of the individual applications and decisions that come at us. And I think checking in, and if it's on an individual property, this sort of like broad umbrella policy now becomes very specific details on a site. But it factors into things like when staff are reviewing, what are the servicing impacts? Water and sewer, were we anticipating in our master plan that site would have X number of units and load on the system? And some of that is, well, plus minus, it was an engineered, master plan, and there's factors in there, but we should be doing that accounting every little bit along the way. Yeah.
It kind of relates to my next question, which is, obviously we have a limit, and that limit is probably going to be water. Do we know, with our current water situation and what we're working on for water, where can we draw the line? Because the government's coming in and they're mandating a certain amount of density, and some smaller rural communities are pushing back, saying we can't fulfill this need for housing because we just simply don't have the infrastructure to do it. So do we know what that number is and what that number would be? Low, medium, high? Like, can we sustain any kind of more aggressive growth, or are we really kneecapped here? It's
a really good question, because as I'm waving my hands here, that if someone's watching on Zoom, they probably can't see what I'm trying to express, is that it's one of those, you squeeze it here, something balances out over on the other side. When our engineering consultants are doing the water master plan, they're modeling the water demand or the sewer demand. They're looking to us to say, well, what are your growth projections? What's your plan? What's your zoning? What's your OCP say? So that OCP, it really sort of factors in. So they were all asking, and like when we're updating our DCC bylaws and stuff, okay, what infrastructure are you going to need over the coming years? Well, what growth are you expecting? Knowing that we still don't have a shiny, clear crystal ball, we're making up projections given the best information we have. And that's what's laid out in the report here. So like the water master plan was looking at, okay, what do we think that build out over 30 years might look like? And, it speaks to, you're going to need another water tower for more storage at some point. Your source is okay. You got some quality issues we're working on, but those are things that factor into it. So I think that the short answer to your question is, we need to be, if we're changing or seeing different patterns of growth, and again, if it, for the next every 2, 3, 5 years, are we seeing low growth, or if we're experiencing something different, do we need to cycle back and go, hey, let's double check our water master plan? Are we actually ahead of that? Are we going to get to a day when we're talking seriously about Kennedy Lake again, or another water tower, or that sort of thing, sooner than we thought? So that's the imperfect science of trying to model out what are the demands going to be, and therefore what's the infrastructure we're going to need. In all those scenarios, as any of the planners or Smart Growth BC or any of those folks would say, the type of growth also matters. Is it greenfield development and sprawl and all new infrastructure, versus are you infilling and using new development as an opportunity to also replace some of your existing infrastructure and add capacity into a system that already has demands. That's also an important part of it. So to get back to your question, yes, there are communities who are saying, hey, we don't have the water, we don't have the sewer capacity to handle more units. With what we're seeing coming from the province, and we'll see what sort of legislation comes. Is that going to affect, in existing neighborhoods? Are you going to start seeing more density and more impact? Possibly. We have already taken some steps to change our zoning, allowing accessory dwelling units potentially. Again, that doesn't play out into instantly there's 300 more homes, but over time it could. So again, we need to factor that into the infrastructure plans.
That was a great question about water, and that was exactly why we held a meeting with the Klulethat a couple of weeks ago to ask what their future needs were going to be with their building out, because we are the water purveyors for them. And we needed that information in order to make sure that when we do our upgrades that we were taking them into consideration as well. Mr. Gregg, do you have more of your presentation before we get to your 3 key questions?
No? I'm just
Okay.
I'm trying to think. 3 key questions.
It's on page 28.
Can I make a comment before we get to the questions? This is a
Sure.
timely opportunity to do that.
You bet.
Through the mayor, I vividly remember the presentation you made, Bruce, a couple of years ago, because I came to that meeting and I remember finding it insightful and cogent and succinct, and in a lot of ways it's what prompted me to get more involved and ultimately run for council. I think you've raised a few issues, and I just made a few notes here, and these are my own thoughts, but I want to run through them because this is, an issue that I care a lot about. The first one was that you mentioned these sort of unpredictable cycles and how we don't see linear growth, and I remember making that exact comment that a lot of these projections, the most logical way to think of them is as a linear projection, as a system where if you pull down here, something goes up there. And I remember thinking that's absolutely not how these systems work. They work in unpredictable ways, and the fact that 2 years later, we're already seeing unanticipated results from the very few policies that have been enacted is proof of that. And you also said, well, there is no throttle. And I think, okay, we can have a semantic debate, but I think that the council is the throttle. Like, we're the throttle here. And that's what the town looks to the council to do, is not to throttle in a bad way, but to exert influence and control so that we as a community go in a direction that represents where we're all at. So I think it's not helpful to sort of say, well, there's really nothing we can do except sit back and watch and make abstract decisions. Like, every time that we make a decision on anything that comes before us, we are that throttle. One of the issues that you've come back to again and again that Councillor Kennington also asked you about is, okay, as zoned, if we look at the map as zoned, I may be proven wrong, but I feel like every single meeting that I've been at, there's been someone who's come before the council and has asked for a rezoning, and it's always a rezoning that sort of upzones. Maybe the fellow who said, "Oh, I'll forego all of the commercial interest in my land if you guys let me build a short-term rental." But like, every single person that's come before us is saying, "Actually, we want a different zoning. We want more." And it's really hard to say no to a lot of those people. But the sum total of all of that after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we can't ignore that. So that's a buffer that I think we need to leave ourselves. So much of our residential growth is ultimately controlled by financial considerations that are directly and indirectly affected by tourism growth. Like, I think right now what's limiting a lot of people from, buying into the community and supporting themselves with housing in this community is the fact that it's gotten completely out of reach financially. Not just for the bottom income earners, but even, there's, to my knowledge, there's not a single job in Ucluelet that pays enough that you could buy like the average house here. And so this to me is a problem, because we can sit here and talk until the cows come home about how, well, you know, as zone, there's still all this room for growth. The only way that we're going to have those homes being purchased by people who live here is if we can either subsidize that through affordable housing initiatives, or if we can take pressure off of the system of the market and hopefully see, I don't think we'll see prices drop, but maybe we'll sort of see people catch up. And so I think that that's something else to consider. As long as we have a growth scenario that sees non-residential uses for a lot of these properties, it's only going to exacerbate the problem. And then a lot of the issues that I hear about firsthand and that come before the council that the people who live here are concerned about are, loss of community, loss of green space, loss of, the familiar, comfortable place that they want. And I see, even this medium growth, slow-ish growth, whatever you want to call it, to get the word slow in there and make it sound better than it is. I see that, we're invariably going to be confronting a lot of these issues no matter what. And I remember coming out of that meeting thinking, boy, like, the slow growth really seems like the logical one, because it leaves the door open to all of these rezoning requests, to the fact that housing is already so expensive that we're only going to see a certain type of buyer for many years to come. Those are just my points. I mean, they lead me to a personal conclusion as to how I would answer your three questions, but I just wanted to put that out there and get it on the record before we go move on to your questions. And yeah, this is just something that I care deeply about, so I wanted to yammer on a bit.
Excellent question, and I think the way you I think captured that the throttle. I guess I just want to clarify what I was trying to say is it's not like there's a direct, we withhold a building permit because we've hit our quota for the year. It's not that direct, but you're absolutely right. The throttle is in council's hands. It's the decision on changing that land use plan and the OCP, or the rezonings that get into the fine-grained detail of that. Those add up, that affect your growth rate, and that really those are community decisions. You're elected to make them for the community. I mean, that really is the process. It can affect it, particularly if you look at let's look at this over a 30-year span of many councils, and where are we headed? When do we say yes? When do we say no to those rezoning requests? That can absolutely affect what's the pace. The wild card that we're hearing about is that the province is, for the first time in decades, saying, we want to tweak that a little bit of how it happens at the local level.
Councillor Hort. And Abby, could I just get you to open the door, please? It's getting really hot in here.
I'm just going to add a little comment on Councillor Mafty's comments, which I love, and it's more that I want to wholeheartedly agree with a lot of it, and this is just a little illustrative tale, as it were. So, one of my colleagues was asked where they saw themselves in 5 years, and the response was the only thing that they were looking to be able to do in 5 years was afford a mortgage and live in the town they had been born and raised in.
And how realistic is that? I don't want to interrupt, but that's my immediate follow-up question.
Right? Yeah. And it was just, but I mean, it was like, well, that's not what the person was really looking for, is it? But that was like the full-on answer. And if that meant moving away to somewhere where they could afford it, then so be it. And we lose a really good, really smart person and a great worker. But, that's the reality.
Yeah. There's two pieces. I mean, when we talk about growth, that's kind of the abstract. How many units are, it becomes sort of a little removed, but it's what I think the specifics of what kind of growth, what type of it. Is it a unit that is being added that is being accessed by a Ucluelet resident? That has a totally different impact than if it's a second home for somebody who's coming from Toronto and isn't part of, doesn't really have that second home, doesn't change the balance or the pressure that Ucluelet residents are experiencing today. So it's really what is the type really affects at the sort of personal and community level. But all growth has an environmental impact, an impact on emissions, on, I think there's a whole, sort of other side of it that could also be looked at as what's sort of the carrying capacity. There were some discussions when we were talking about the whole West Coast, study as well of like what is the end? What is the carrying capacity? And there's a lot of debate and different ways of sort of looking at that. Unfettered growth and no sort of community input or control of that, I would argue, would be not what anyone's going to be happy with the results of at the end of the day. But at the same time, and it's starting to foreshadow and lead into the next topic of what the federal government's talking about is Housing Accelerator Fund. We're talking about growth in a low growth scenario, but are we accelerating? Is that something we want to pursue or get into? Maybe. There may be some positives that could come out of this, but it is also talking about accelerating growth for a period of time. And so we can get into that, but it's tricky.
Can I make one very brief follow-up point? One of the issues I noted here, and I didn't speak to, is the fact that with all of these growth scenarios, even just the build out, we're dealing with additional infrastructure costs. One of the things that's been eye-opening for me as a new councillor is gaining a greater appreciation for the burden and the challenge and the sort of implications of our current infrastructure situation, and to imagine that even if we sort of scale back, we're still gonna see that problem not just hold steady but grow, is really daunting. Because once we start talking about actual growth, it's like, so hang on, we're going to have growth that's probably going to benefit a certain demographic, and yet the whole community is going to have to bear the cost of that in terms of the increased service costs of adding all of this infrastructure. And that to me is also a little bit worrisome.
And now I want to drag some other slides out of my pocket from another analysis that I did a few years ago. But again, it's a really great point of like, not all growth is equal that way on the impact on the costs of servicing that growth. And that's where, smart growth or infill has a completely different impact. So if you think of a unit, that housing unit, say it's an accessory dwelling unit in someone's backyard on Helen Road, where there's a water line and a sewer line there, and it has the capacity, and that is a rental unit that a Ucluelet resident is able to live in. Okay, what are the impacts of that? It's using existing infrastructure. The tax base, the value of that property goes up. So your tax base increases, they're paying a little higher taxes, but they're also getting rent from the ADU. We'll have a whole other discussion on how do you finance building that thing. But so overall, you've added growth, you've added a unit, but it's actually, you've expanded your tax base, paying for the same infrastructure you have today, and you have to pay to replace it on the same date down the road anyway, versus create a new subdivision, create a second home, also adds to your tax base, but also adds to your asset and your infrastructure burden. You got to start socking away the money to maintain and replace those assets as well. So the pattern of development really impacts how sustainable it is for towns. And so towns that have had rapid low density, like suburban development, that can be a great pattern for a while until infrastructure starts to age and you get 50 years down the road and you're starting to replace it, and do you have enough tax base? So there's sort of an efficiency of that, where there's lots of studies of sort of the financing of what's sort of a better balance of that and the net impact. And so some of the older neighborhoods that seem to be financially in the best state, even with aging infrastructure, are think of some of the cities, the Kitsilano, the Fernwood, the older, fairly compact post-war or even earlier lots, which now have 2 or 3 dwellings on them in many cases. And the price of those properties may be quite high, but there's a lot of rental accommodation in there. The efficiency of the infrastructure, which is aging, but it's got this whole other sort of density of use compared to suburban infrastructure, completely different picture. And much more positive to have that sort of more compact infill, pattern. So, yes, there's an impact, but it all gets back to it depends. What's the type and specifics of it? So, what are the policies that pointed in the right direction versus allowing something that's going to have a unexpected consequence or costs down the road? I'd argue it's responsible for us to wrestle with that by having infrastructure master plans and asset management plans and be trying to tackle that today, as opposed to leave it for the town to sort out 30 years from now. And so that's what we try to do.
I have discussions with people all the time who want no growth at all. Stop the growth. But the problem with that is we become a Martha's Vineyard, and every house that exists right now quadruples in price because we are a desirable place to live, and all those people's property taxes quadruple in price, causing them to have to sell their homes and move somewhere more affordable. So there's kind of it's a double-edged sword, in my opinion.
And that describes what many, I mean, I think Ucluelet is a town and a real community where the resort economics have sort of arrived, as opposed to a created resort community. But those forces are at play here. And in many resort communities, it's all resort and no community, because eventually, your workforce buses in to Martha's Vineyard, and it changes what is the town.
On that note, though, this is a point that I've either brought up or has been brought up to me a million times in so many different discussions, and there's absolutely no shortage of examples. Lots of ski towns have this bus-in dynamic, but here, where are people going to bus in from? We can't. No one's going to bus in from Port Alberni to work a minimum wage job.
They do to the fish plants.
So
They do, but not sustainably. And it's only going to get worse and worse. Like, that is not solving the current problem. And so I think it would be a mistake. That's not desirable no matter what, but I don't think that's sustainable to plan on.
in the mountain resort world, they refer to it as the Down Valley Syndrome. And Aspen has Carbondale. Everyone's living in Carbondale and working in Aspen. Now, that's 50 years ago. Whistler, Pemberton, Squamish. Now, what does it cost to live in Pemberton or Squamish? So there are many examples of that dynamic that can happen. To some extent, one of the opportunities and challenges for Ucluelet is that's a bit of the dynamic between Tofino and Ucluelet. There are people who live here and commute to work in Tofino, but there are also people, as the mayor was saying, who are working in Ucluelet, and the businesses are having to bust them in from Port Alberni to keep a workforce. That same business would say, hey, if we had 100 housing units, we'd fill it, and we'd actually be able to make more use of the infrastructure we have for processing fish. And that's, so that diversity of your economy, constraint seems to be housing, and affordable housing that a Ucluelet resident making a Ucluelet wage can afford to get into and attain. That is, there's a whole lot of factors there. But that's I think the challenge, and where, I'm thinking of the slide where up until about 2015, the balance was different in Ucluelet. That mostly the housing was being bought by residents for housing. That changed, and arguably the buyer changed, the money they brought changed, and some of that had to do with the ability to, we'll pay some of the bills with Airbnb revenue, which is not housing, but there's a bunch of dynamics at play here.
I think it's interesting. We're talking about tourist accommodation and how we're busing in people, and to me that's where the advantage of the B&B is, because you're not busing people and you're doing it yourself, or at least in the true spirit of it is, whereas hotels require massive amounts of staff and they are not paid well enough to afford a home. So if we're going to limit tourist accommodation, it should be limited from hotels and put towards putting that focus on people affording to buy their home using a B&B. I know it's not a popular opinion, but that is the reality, is most people are flipping those beds themselves. They have their own accommodation for themselves. They're not units that can be rented. So, I've always been a proponent for B&Bs. I ran one. Couldn't have done it without it. And it wasn't out of greed, and it was literally out of necessity. So, a B&B isn't the cause of the housing crisis as much as it is a result of the housing crisis.
Symptom, yeah, absolutely.
And so that's one of the things that we just need to consider, I think, moving forward, and that it's the people who are coming to us and asking for this. And as a designer, I've developed several B&B suites for people, and the story is always the same. It's very rare that somebody comes to me wanting to do a hotel. It's happened once, and I've turned it down because it's not what I believe in, but I think somewhere we need to soften our stance on the B&B and really look at tourism and large player tourist accommodations that require the kind of housing that we can't provide.
And I'd say it's Again, it's complicated. That it really good points. It does mean that the person who is owning their home and paying a higher mortgage, I mean, why is the mortgage so high? You know, you're competing with other people who are going to run bigger B&Bs. I mean, it's the commercial value of that residential property is now in the market, and that's that graph that goes from $450,000 or $500,000 for a home to $9. You know, that's not residential value. That's not workers making a higher wage who are happy to pay a higher mortgage in town. That's something else that's been layered on. And those are the buyers we've seen and that are coming in, and part of the balance is, hey, I can make this work and the zoning allows it, but that's now commercial value that's in your residential zones. And some of that has displaced what would have been residential uses. So what's the balance of all that? In the analysis we've done, we say, okay, to make a simple picture of it, assume the B&Bs are just as they are now, capped at that point, and that the tourist accommodation growth happens in lands that we've already zoned for some tourist accommodation growth. So it's about 356 units was the lowest growth scenario. So if we allow 350 more B&B units, it means say no to all the hotels or motels from expanding, or else you're not hitting that lowest growth scenario. So it's complicated with a bunch of different factors at play. But I think that is one thing with the B&Bs, it has positive implications for a property owner, like having that flexibility, having that potential revenue to fall back on. Absolutely. But it also changes the value of the lands and who can access it. So.
It'd be interesting to see, having just built a home 2 years ago, and how much that cost. It was eye-watering, and I did most of the work myself, and it was still eye-watering to see a graph of the price of construction relative to the cost of housing, because we've always focused these graphs on the correlation between Airbnb and the price of a home, when really every factor has that exact same curve, right? So I just don't want to focus our energy in the wrong place, because if it is in fact something else, we need to address that as well.
Right. I don't mean to debate the point, but B&Bs are something we're going to have lots of discussions and debates about. The things that you can affect, like we can affect, like the number of people who decide to make Ucluelet home and move here, new residents coming here. Those are decisions of people who if they have the means will move here. We can't really affect them directly. Construction costs we don't regulate. We regulate land use. So that is why it keeps coming up. Is one of the tools you have is the dial on what's your zoning allow. What are the uses, the densities, the location of where that is. Those are that's the toolkit that the local government really has. So.
Councillor Anderson.
If I could just jump in with a quick question here. It would seem to me like there are some, like listening to it, your example of someone that's having potentially a hard time staying here, there are some solutions. This could be a bit of a silver lining if I understand it correctly, but in an example like Lot 13 in BC Housing, there are some things in there that are potentially would open up the door to somebody that is in town, and I think there are certain caveats to that, being a local resident, and at least get their foot in the door. So I was just sitting here thinking, is there anything positive here that I can think of? But I also know that the development, like a lot of these bigger developments, also come with that's how we're going to get our purpose-built rental. Dedicated rental as well. So I know that there's I get the balancing act, but I'm just trying to think of a positive spin here, and I sounded like that Lot 13 was pretty good to me. I don't know. Sorry, just trying to change the mood.
That's okay. I will say that I'm pretty sure half of our employees that are not currently housed somewhere safe are on the list for Lot 13. I know of 5 off the top of my head that are.
And I'd say, if I could, through the mayor, there are a number of things I think that Ucluelet has put into play and will continue to try and focus on too, because affordability of housing in a town that's being affected by resort economics is a wicked challenge. There's no one answer. You need all of the above. So non-market housing, a project like Lot 13, decisions on zoning, to ensure, does every lot continue to have a piece of tourist accommodation, or are there some that are just housing? they will be priced differently. They will have pros and cons, to what you get in those neighborhoods. The decision and discussion around the zoning of the land at Monado Bay, where tourist accommodation is not part of that neighborhood that they were proposing, and so there are various elements of non-market housing and also more attainable market housing in there as well. So getting rental housing and expressing it as, our OCP says, it's a priority. It is seen as something that we can use more of, is rental housing supply. Market, also non-market. That's a strong signal when it's in your OCP to a developer who's asking, well, what would the town like to see? What could I possibly do on my land if I'm asking for rezoning and maybe higher density and whatnot? So I think all of those are good steps. It takes time for things to come on board. It would be great to see how some of those affect the housing supply when they're actually constructed and people have moved in. But it takes time. It's not, we can improve the zoning, but the other side that we don't control is, what are the decisions of the individuals and the property owners and the interest rates, and how does that affect the pace of development and the timing of it? That's
Quick question, sorry. One little quick question. The housing needs assessment report identified a certain number of units that were short. So with the current developments that we have that are in the works, the apartment building, Monado Bay, Lot 13, are we close? Are we putting a dent in that, or are we losing the battle here?
So those are all positives, and so the question is, how much more tourist accommodation comes online too? Because all of that creates more jobs, more workers, more cleaners, more people working in demand in restaurants. That's sort of the bigger picture of it. Those, if they all come online, are a good step. It starts to get into, I'd say, the Housing Accelerator Fund, the next report, and that it raises some questions. There's some things that we could do. I think there have been some positive steps that the town has taken. There's a list of over 30 items that we've all sort of talked about, staff and council, of maybe things that are coming. Some of those could be even further. I think are there things that we could do to influence or encourage, incentivize, help with the creation of more secondary suites, accessory dwelling units, which are rental spaces for locals, or rental zoning for multifamily and other forms of that, as well as continuing to stay involved in projects to create non-market housing, developing some of the support infrastructure, supporting a housing authority to help manage that stuff. I mean, those are all things that the town could do. What has been approved in the last couple of years in some of those rezonings is, I think, a good first step. I wouldn't say it solved if all that gets built. That solves no.
No, but we're on the right track.
I do think that Euclid has taken some really good steps. Yeah.
Great.
And none of these problems are specific to Euclid. I grew up in Vancouver. Lance and I both grew up in Vancouver, and our first home was a float home for 11 years because that's all we could afford after getting out of an apartment. But it got our foot in the door to not real estate, essentially, but at the housing market. So, yeah, it's you just need that variety of housing types in order to get people to get their leg up.
Through the mayor, and this is a committee of the whole discussion, this part, so it's a little less formal, I guess. So I'm going to jump right in there with the anecdotes, because we usually try to avoid the anecdotes. Although our housing needs assessment, I'll just say to anyone out there listening, was a great capture of dozens and dozens of those stories of Euclid residents who are facing those kinds of challenges. One thing, personally, I'm covered in sawdust and dressed for doing renos, but I'm not the only manager in working for the district, and admittedly, we make a very good wage in this town, so we got 3 managers living in Whispering Pines. We're renovating an old trailer because it was part of okay, we're facing a renoviction at the end of the month. That's where the market's at. That changed from when we moved here. In our case, we've lived in expensive housing market after expensive housing market, and we're always about 2 years behind. But this, this is great. We're excited. We're going to have this awesome garden in Whispering Pines and a very funky renovated trailer. So, affordability is always a compromise. Is a good way of thinking about it. Where we would all love to live in a wonderful waterfront home, but those compromises that make things affordable are things like the type of housing, the size of it, the location, the age of it, the tenure. I rent instead of own because I can afford it. Like all those things you sort of find your place on the spectrum, the ladder of housing, where you have people who in town who are in in the housing assessment refers to the core housing need, where those compromises get to the point where its health and safety and well-being are really impacted by overcrowding or substandard housing. That's where it becomes really critical, and arguably that's where you do the most effort on interventions. And so we're, going after, we should at the end of this month hear hopefully on a grant for that rapid housing initiative. That's another piece that, the town can sort of take on. But I think that again, so sorry for the personal anecdote, but I think that's an indication of, where families are at and the decisions individuals are making. Where do wages get you into the housing market in Euclid? It's very different than it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Gregg. Great conversation around this. Do you want discussion over your 3 key questions? Through the mayor, the questions kind of relate and a little foreshadowing to the report on the Housing Accelerator Fund, and go directly to it, because it's this the Housing Accelerator Fund program. I'll just get into it, I guess. For CMHC, which is another item on the agenda here, is a kind of unique type of grant program that they're announcing, which is going to open soon, and we've looked at the details, and there's some pros and cons to it. But it just, I think in the context of this, some sense of, if you're accelerating housing, well, that has an impact on your growth. So if it were just like, that's a question worth considering, whether it's answered now or in the sort of next item, to sort of say, are we on the right track? And I think I wanted to make, I guess that discussion we've already had around growth over a 30-year picture may be very different than what growth are we seeing this year or next year over a short time span. So I guess some input on what's council's take on the community, kind of temperature on where that could go. And I've heard some of that. Okay, that sounds like let's skip those 3 questions and move on. 8.1 has been removed from the agenda, so we will move into reports. We have 6 report items this afternoon. The first report item is 9.1, Housing Accelerator Fund Program. Mr. Gregg.
Thank you, and through the mayor. Okay, right into it. So this is the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund. It's a grant program, which, as I just mentioned, is different than your typical municipal grant program, where they typically, whether it's the province or the federal government, they're looking at a project and funding something you're going to build or something you're going to do, whether it's you're going to come up with a plan or a master plan or do some engineering or build infrastructure or a building or whatever. It's usually a specific project of what are you going to spend the money on. This is different than what we've seen, and it's really creating a carrot for municipalities. They're incentivizing, I was going to say bribing, I guess I just did, incentivizing municipalities to accelerate the approval and construction of housing across the country. They're putting up $2 billion. The deadline is September of 2026. They want to see 100,000 more housing units constructed than would have otherwise been built. Their goal is, or their rationale around it is, we need more housing. We're trying to catch up. Also, they want to leave a legacy of changes so that you overall get a more streamlined and efficient development system in municipalities across the country. And so that's the carrot is substantial funding based on what's your projection of what you think is going to be, or what's the pattern of building permits that have been issued. So it's all measured on building permits. And they're going to look at census data, how many have been issued over so many years. They have all that across the country. And the application is really saying, okay, well, here's our plan. If we do these things, we think it's going to accelerate the issuance of building permits. And so if they like your plan and you're successful in this grant application, then essentially there's a funding agreement that, based on the number of building permits that are issued between now and September 2026, they will essentially cut a check to the municipality. The funding plan of what you do with it, as we're told again and again, is very flexible. So whether you want to, so it's not show us the water line engineered, it's shovel ready that you're going to put it to. If you want to say, well, we just want to build our water and sewer reserves, or we're going to put it towards a reserve or it's a whole series of projects for expanding our parks and trails and pathway network, or we're going to build a new fire hall, or we're going to do this Saturday. That's not their focus and concern. It's more, what are you going to do to increase the building permit activity? So again, if that were the case, if we were to go after that, it would mean, I guess the implications are, a lot of it would be within planning and building. Here's a list of things that we've been talking about doing. Do we accelerate that and try and do them sooner rather than later? Does that result in more building permits being issued? Presumably, it would be more. Exactly how many more depends on the decisions of individuals. So you could do all of this, and then if interest rates stay or go higher and people choose not to build and put it off, well, then it may not result in the same cash, because they're literally going to be counting up what are the building permits, and they have a factor of going to be writing a check for the municipality based on what they are. So that's sort of the framework of it. And given that the list that we sort of went through, the different sort of categories, seems like there's a lot of items which could qualify that we've been talking about with council. And really, a lot of them will be, okay, they're on the to-do list, but some of them are side of desk, and it may be a few years before we get to them. The question is, okay, do we tackle this as a priority to accelerate some of that in a way that, I guess the question, if we focus on the kinds of housing that Ucluelet residents need, and that the growth is focused on that type of incentives or changes that accelerate that, arguably that's a catching up as opposed to a real alteration of what's the long-range vision for the town. That's kind of the question, and we're looking at it going, well, this is unique. It's a one-time intake, as they're saying. It's kind of now or never coming from the federal government if communities want to be on this. And it's going to be a competitive process. I'm sure there are communities all across the country who will be going after this. A lot of it will be focused on cities, but they do have a large community and then a small community stream, if you will, that says that they'll also be apportioning to make sure that the funds are going across the country in different types of communities. They're spreading it around. So, and part of, last thought is they've said that they will, they'll commit to what your plan is. So say we're going to housing needs assessment, and the land use study said, well, you've got somewhere on the West Coast, the land use study said between 556 and 820 something, missing units on the West Coast, and Ucluelet's portion of that would be about 54% of that. That kind of aligns with what the housing assessment was saying. So, are we lacking, or could we use another 300 plus minus units in Ucluelet? Yes, that would sure help in our housing situation. So, do you accelerate those? Sort of. I guess that's kind of the really rough framework of that. If we had a plan that said, okay, over 4 years, we're going to try and increase to build a significant chunk of those to go from a couple dozen new residential building permits to, add another 50 over a period, 4-year span. If they sort of accept that plan and we end up getting only 30, well, you're paid per building permit. And one of the questions I said, well, what if it actually works so well, you're building so many ADUs and secondary suites and stuff that you get 70 in a year, or you sort of overshoot? The answer from CMHC was, well, you're going to have communities that don't hit their targets, and you're going to have communities that exceed them, and we will reward good behavior. that it's the carrot. It's not paternalistic at all, but it really is. They've earmarked the $2 billion to try and achieve these 100,000 units. And I think at the end of the day, if you've got more and someone has less, the money will flow. In rough numbers, that could be $6 or $8 million over the program. And that was doing on a sticky note, okay, take the lot 13, lot 16, Manado Bay, not assume every unit's going to get built. Okay, 50% of this and do a little bit of that, and we do some ADUs and legalize some secondary suites, add it up, 250 units. That's a lot of development in Ucluelet over a 4-year period of time. But is that if it's those units, is that catching up on what is the latent demand that we have today? Maybe this adds up to a good program. So, not that I'm trying to sell it, but the question is there. If we go for this, it would be definitely, it would affect council's strategic priority, because it would mean saying building this housing is a strategic priority. We're going to do everything we can to try and set it up. It's going to take resources, some of that cash from the feds. It should be going to hiring the people to get some of this stuff done, because it's not going to be a side-of-desk effort. It's going to impact all departments in the organization. It really is kind of an organizational, let's shift and change a lot of things to support that housing development. Just a little question for council.
Thank you. I was really impressed with what the money can be used for. It can be used for hiring staff or consultants, purchasing land, installing services, building affordable housing, contributing to infrastructure reserves, improving parks and trails, or transportation infrastructure. Those are really broad items.
It appears that it gets to the question earlier of, you have communities who are saying, if you're expecting us to have all this, 4 units per residential lot, we don't have the infrastructure for it. Part of it is saying, well, okay, here's the money. You use it wisely. You know what is needed. So arguably, instead of don't find new shiny projects, but deal with some of the infrastructure deficit and top up your reserves and sort of start there, it's probably a healthy way to approach it. But really, they are very open and flexible depending on what does the community need. Is it more recreation and trails and parks, or is it you're going to need land so you can start building a reserve to acquire that land for the day you need it? Those kinds of things.
It really seems like a golden opportunity to do infill housing, because when you have a greenfield development, the developer pays for a lot of the infrastructure. But if we're just talking about densifying single family lots or whatever, there's no one there to really foot the bill for the upkeep, and there's no new money. So it's an opportunity to increase density in land that we already have and use that accelerator fund money to bring our services up to the carrying capacity of those lots. So it's a fantastic opportunity. I think I support going for it.
Any other questions from council?
Can I ask, this
Councillor
is a
Mashti?
stupid question. Hypothetically speaking, I have a whole bunch of scenarios that I'm imagining, and I just want to see if would it even be something that would be allowed in this system to, for example, subsidize ADUs? Like, let's say someone wants to build an ADU and they say, oh boy, what's holding me back is that I don't have the money that it takes to actually build this. Could we have a subscription program where someone says, yeah, I'll build it if you guys subsidize it?
So on the list there are a couple of things. You give them a free building permit. You could accelerate their building permit, potentially a grant, legalize or create a new secondary suite or an ADU, and the municipality gives you a grant for it.
I think the grant is what might.
And
make the
BC
difference for
Housing's
people.
announced they got a $40,000 forgivable loan for creating new secondary suites that they're bringing online in the fall. You've got to compete for those, But those are the kinds of things where, if, say, the municipality said, okay, well, there's a cost to all of those things. But if CMHC is giving us $20,000 per building permit, and we focus on, okay, let's try and get 40 ADUs per year over the next 3 years, each one of them, because it's ground-oriented missing middle housing, it's not just the $20,000, it's the added 12 for that unit. So we're getting $32,000 coming in for issuing the building permit for that ADU. Give them a grant for $5,000 if that tips them over. the edge. Streamline the whole process so it's easy and fast and efficient. Give them a free building permit. It might be a money-making exercise for the municipality. That's the carrot that the feds are putting out with this. So again, if I think that's a good example because it gets back to that. There's housing and then there's housing. There's growth and then there's growth. A rental unit like an ADU or a secondary suite arguably has huge value. It's infill in an existing neighborhood. That's something we can, encouraging it in the right place. You're not having to expand a road or water line to get there. It gives flexibility for a family and a household to say, well, maybe it's a rental unit. Maybe it just ends up being my mother-in-law or my kids who want to move back home and I don't want them under my roof, so they're out in the cottage. That kind of flexibility is great. A lot of them do end up becoming, again, if the zoning says that's not a tourist accommodation unit, that is a long-term rental, or it's guest or family, there will be a number of them that become rental units. That's great diversity to add into your housing supply. It's a little more compact. It's like the secondary suite in many cases. I mean, arguably, we've had this discussion around, the cottage is like a secondary suite, but it gives you a little more privacy, a little more space. Seeing divorced couples who end up in secondary suites, raising kids, little cottage is a huge quality of life boost over the secondary suite sometimes. Like it's small things that I think could add up to some, benefits in the community. So, sorry, long answer to your question, but yes, potentially a grant program could be part of it. So that's
Stupendous.
if we can convince CMHC that we're on the right track and they commit to funding it.
Any other questions from council? Councillor Anderson?
Oh, I was just going to add that it looks like what you wrote there, it looks like you've already checked all the boxes pretty much. It sounds like.
We're trying to think, and we're looking at, okay, what are all the things that have been talked about that are already on the radar of either things that we need to clean up in our bylaws and in our processes that, it's trying to modernize all of our processes as much as possible. We try and get ahead of it, but sometimes that's side of desk. But if this brings us some resources to do it sooner rather than later, that would be good. And I think it's things that council and the community have identified of like, here's the things that we need. If there's a way of sort of packaging them and it gets us the funding to do it, then it's, we're looking for council for direction. Is it something we should prioritize? I guess.
And I see there is a 45-day window, which is pretty tight.
That's why we have a report in front of you today before they even open their portal and give us all of the details, is that, and part of it in their communication is said, don't wait because there's a lot. We don't need a final resolution from council today authorizing the application because it doesn't exist yet. But before we spend a lot of time on this, because it will take some serious staff time to put the details together for CMHC to be competitive with it. We want to know that we're on the right track. And we're anticipating, initially they were talking late June, now latest we've heard is probably early July. It's going to sort of open. Of course, that's great time when you have municipalities with people taking vacations and stuff. 45 days goes by pretty quick in July and August.
It does, and I see there is a staff recommendation. Would council like to make a motion?
I'd like to move that, please. I'd move that council direct staff to prepare an application to the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund, HAF program as a strategic priority.
I will second that.
Thank you, Councillor Kennington. Councillor Hoare has seconded. Any further discussion?
I'd just jump in to say that I think the ADUs would be a really, really interesting thing to focus on because I see that it helps people who already own property and it makes it more affordable without having to look at a short-term rental, and it creates stable housing. I have no doubt that there's a lot I don't know that I'd look forward to learning from you and district staff, but from the little I do know, the ADUs, I don't want to say it's like a silver bullet solution, but I think it's something that Ucluelet could really, really benefit from. And what's holding us back is that it's just not financially doable for so many people. And if there's a way to make those ADUs more viable, I think they could serve this community very well.
And I think it's the building costs that have escalated that have deterred people from pursuing that avenue.
That's what I've heard time and again.
To that point, I'm designing an ADU for a friend of mine right now, so I should have some numbers that we can chew on, and that might help It's working out pretty well, and we're looking forward to getting in front of the planning department and some of these new programs. It's kind of a shame that grant coming in the fall. It's like we kind of want to get that permanent now.
That'd be conflict of interest.
Well, I'm gonna have to recuse myself. Well,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to come in front of council anymore.
That's right. We approved it.
But it's actually looking like it might be somewhat affordable. So, if the design is done modestly, we're thinking around 200,000 for a 600 square foot unit.
Wow.
But we have to wait for the numbers to come in.
Yeah.
But it might not be as bad as some of us, including me, originally thought.
Excellent. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Thank you. The second report item is 9.2, DVP for residential addition at 272 Main Street. After planning staff present, the applicant will have an opportunity to address council. I believe he's on Zoom. Mr. Gregg.
Thank you. Through the mayor, I'll just reset my brain slightly. So this is a variance request for 272 Main Street. There will also be a development permit associated with this, but today we're really looking at first for direction on the development variance permit. Council may recall this came, or a similar application came forward last fall, and it was not successful. And the applicant has changed their application somewhat, and so here it is. So the proposal is a 3-story residential dwelling addition to what currently is a sort of mixed commercial residential building located at 272 Main Street, and I think everyone in council will recognize the building. The physical location design of the unit at the back really has not changed from what had been originally proposed, that it's a modest addition to the rear of the property. The original staff report is attached as Appendix B, which talks about some of the development permit guidelines and whatnot. I would just say there wasn't a lot of discussion from council at the time. It sort of focused on the variance and the parking, I think, at the time. And that, I'd say from the staff level, we're very supportive of the form, the character, the type of development that has been proposed, where it's really a small addition at the rear of the property. And I think a key piece that the owner was quite responsive to a concern that we'd raised around the view from the intersection of Peninsula and Main Street, where as you come down Main Street, you get this view of the harbor. On that property, if it went just to 2 stories at the front, it would block that view of the harbor and that sort of glimpse of the water right in the center of town. And in response to that, his plan is really to build a very small footprint of addition at the rear of the property, which stays out of the view, which is, in terms of the form and character, we think is a positive thing. So, as it is today, what he's tweaked a bit is the proposal around, originally he was proposing to vary all parking and create some improvements on the street in terms of landscaping and streetscaping. And now the proposal is really, the variance would be to allow them to pay cash in lieu. The property currently has no on-site parking, similar to a number of other older properties in the center of the town. That parking is really shared on the street. It's not dedicated. It's not privatized or resident only or business only. So it, like many of the other buildings in the area, really doesn't have on-site parking. So with the addition, the requirement, we clarified the uses on the ground floor. It is all residential, so therefore it would need 1 additional parking space. The zoning in the village center allows for paying cash in lieu, which is $8,000 that's paid to the district. That would go into our parking reserve fund so that we can improve on-street parking or build parking lots like Cedar Road and others that that the district may take on. So it would be a contribution to the parking reserve instead of, and in recognition of the fact that there'll be some impact on the on-street parking. And really that the way the zoning is written, that you can use up to 50% of your parking requirement can be met in the village square with that cash in lieu. We're talking about 1 space, so a fraction. It doesn't help to build half a parking space and pay for the other half. So it really would be a variance to allow them to use 100%, to pay for the space, if you will, the additional space that would be required. The other 2 variances, one is there's a setback variance on the Helen Road frontage, varying, and that hasn't really changed. That was part of the original plan, where it is a sort of an odd-shaped lot, and so the one corner of the building does get closer to this setback. But also, the way the mixed-use zoning reads is essentially it describes or defines mixed use as the sort of typical residential above commercial. So it's, ground floor is seen as commercial only, and your residential component is above that. And the theory being that keeps the sort of streetscape, the liveliness and attractiveness of your commercial core with having storefronts on the front rather than residential uses. This would be some of the residential will be at the ground floor level, that storage level that's in the back. Really doesn't affect the storefront of this property. It's really tucked in the back anyways, but that would need the variance as well. So that's why there's 3 variances as part of this DVP. As I said, the form and character of the addition really hasn't changed. The materials are the same. It really is the same sort of physical footprint. It's more around the parking and how he's approaching it. And as I said, we clarified what the uses are to bring this forward. Any questions from council? And as I believe the applicant is online and should be given an opportunity to speak to it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gregg. We'll start with council. Any questions from council? Councillor Hoare and I will remember this one from the last term, and I was actually a fan of it, but I got outvoted. No questions from council, so perhaps.
Can you give us new councillor some perspective on what people felt at the time? What was your take, and what was the prevailing take?
It was all about parking. Parking was a big topic back then because we were taking away hundreds of parking spots from around the village green, and so it was just a really hot topic. And then this came before us, and so the FU councillors thought that because parking was a hot topic, that we shouldn't let this go through with no parking, even though that building has never had parking. Correct?
Correct, through the mayor. There has never been on-site parking for that. And one thing I would also point out, because we did look at, well, what if he put his one additional parking space on-site? It would need a driveway entrance off of the back, off of Helen Road. It would actually remove an on-street parking space to add an off-site parking space. So the net number of parking spaces in the village center would not increase. It would just move it onto the private side. So that was one of the elements I meant to mention.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, if they were to put that driveway in, would we be losing trees? I assume we would be, because
It
going on the
would
site.
mean a culvert. There's quite a ditch for a little section of Helen Road there. So I think it meant some expansion of the culvert, and yes, it would go through. There's quite a heavily vegetated bank. How much of it is trees and how much is blackberry and other? It would be definitely greenery, and in terms of the part of this, the development permit area's form and character,
Yeah.
it would certainly impact the view from the street, because you'd have a driveway entrance, possibly with some retaining walls sort of cut into the hillside, because it's quite a slope.
And that could even be a safety concern coming out of that driveway, because that's on a bend as well.
It would not be ideal, but it's a pretty constrained site. But I think a driveway off of Main Street would be a whole other tear down the building to get that access sort of thing.
Any other questions for Mr. Gregg?
I've
Councillor
looked through through the mayor. I just want clarification, because I can't find it explicitly stated, but this would be reserved as like a long-term rental.
Yes.
Is the door open for a potential use of this space to be a short-term rental?
The zoning allows for residential use. It's not a resort. It's not a condo, if you will. So that, unlike the some residential zones and stuff, bed and breakfast is not in their zoning. So it would be a
Okay.
residential use.
That was a question I asked the applicant last time as well.
Okay.
And it is 2 apartments, is it not?
It's one.
Oh, it's just 1 apartment. Okay. Thanks.
It's a 2-level.
Thanks for clarifying that. Does the applicant wish to address us?
I'm just going to unmute the applicant now. You should be able to speak.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Mr. Picciano?
Yes. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for considering this proposal. I think the presentation was very well done. I commend Mr. Gregg, and I think a lot of the discussion that was had at the beginning of this meeting around density and housing and different kinds of housing also touched on many of the things that I can avoid repeating in my presentation. So the only two things that I would add would be that I think this is one of those, let's say, hardship sites where a creative approach to adding long-term housing in the community is really the only way to develop such a lot. And we've taken, great steps in the design approach to make it as, let's say, digestible as possible within the town core, to be both set back in order to preserve views, but also to be somewhat of, potentially a marquee building for the town. We are going to have it Passive House certified at my own cost, under no obligation to do so. So that in itself, I think, would add something to the community of value, and the design does evoke, say, a cannery style that this town was half founded on, let's say. So it's also something that me and my family would potentially see ourselves moving to full-time. And that may not happen immediately after it's built, but the intention is that it would be a long-term rental for somebody. In fact, I have, so many people that want it already that it's kind of crazy. And they're all long-term permanent residents of Ucluelet. So I don't see any downside, as obviously as the applicant, but I don't see any downside as an architect, in adding something like this to the town. So that's my first point, which was long, and I agree maybe branched into other areas. The second point is, and this has been talked about a little bit, the possibility of adding parking on this site, even if it's just one at the rear, and I won't get into the complete details of that, we haven't tried to draw it out, would more than double the cost of just adding this 3-story building. We're talking about blasting rock, huge retaining walls, dealing with runoff culverts, and then the wisdom of placing it on that corner, which is already fraught with terror if you're not a motorist. And even if you are a motorist, trying to pull in and out of that corner can sometimes be harrowing. So that would be my point on the parking, and I think I rest my case.
Thank you. I see that you're also proposing 9 bike stalls in the basement space.
Yeah, and storage is another big issue for my tenants currently. And so what I've proposed is there's an existing unheated storage area, low headroom, but still you can stand up in. I'm proposing that will be turned over to bikes and bike maintenance area, and then the bottom level of the residential area is like a storage basement area.
Thank you. I think this came up last time when you were applying for this, the possibility that your tenants may not even own a car or need a parking space. They could have bicycles, and because they're right in the downtown core, everything is walkable anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I would go a little further and be cheeky about it and say, where are the developments that are targeting people with no cars? This is one of them.
Exactly. Any questions from council for Mr. Picciano? Councillor Anderson?
I was just going to add that this was my first email as councillor. Was from Mr. Picciano, and I remember I wrote back to you and I said I'd look into it. So,
And did you?
We're looking at it now.
Shameless.
I can't control that.
Okay, I think we're good for questions, Mr. Picciano.
Thank you.
There is a staff recommendation. Would council like to make a motion?
I will move that council, with regard to the proposed residential addition at 272 Main Street, Lot 1 District, Lot 282, Clayoquot District Plan 12287, direct staff to give notice for development variance permit DVP 23-05.
And I will second that.
Councillor Anderson seconds. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Congratulations.
He's out.
He's out.
All right, the third report item is 9.3 Canada Day Road Closure. The Director of Parks and Recreation will present this report. Ms. Fortune.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Before you, I have a recommendation that Council authorize the road closure of the portion Fraser Lane between Main Street and Jamie's Whaling Station from 8 to 4 on July 1st. And this is an annual waiver, so I'm looking for annual authorization for the event. It just makes sense to just, instead of continually coming back, we would do any changes if we had a significant change or a change of location. But right now, we're looking at the Village Green, and this will be our first official event on the Village Green, which is kind of exciting.
The new Village Green.
Woohoo! Any questions?
Any questions for Ms. Fortune?
I have one.
Councillor Hoare?
Do I get to beat you at the gumboot toss again this year?
That's Yuki Days.
Oh, that's Yuki Days. You're right.
But yes, but no.
Are you practicing?
Every day, every day.
No, I think this is a good one because it's a great event and it's always well attended.
And we have a bigger Village Green than ever.
Exactly. I like the idea of doing the annual thing so that it's not a return each time.
That's a great idea. There is a staff recommendation. There are actually 3 staff recommendations on page 143, if someone would like to make those.
Sorry, through the mayor, that is Yuki Days. I think we're on Canada Day.
We're on Canada Day
Oh,
first.
Which is
okay,
141.
Sorry, I
Well,
jumped ahead with the
there is-
gumboot toss. That's my fault.
I clipped them together.
I
That
can
was
take
my
that.
problem.
Should I go?
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Anderson.
I would move that council authorize the closure of a portion of Fraser Lane between Main Street and Jamie's Whaling Station from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. in front of the Village Green annually on July 1st for the District of Ucluelet Canada Day event.
I'll second that.
Councillor Hoare seconds. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries.
Thank you very much. Would you like me to carry on?
The fourth report is 9.3 Yuki Days Annual Road Closure and Noise Bylaw. Ms. Fortune.
Thank you. Through the mayor. Before you, you have 3 annual recommendations. One is for Friday night for the barbecue, and that's from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. for the Village Green. The second one is the closure of the road for the Yuki Days Parade. Just for clarification, we will also be obtaining a permit from Highways for the peninsula portion of the road that we're on. And then the third recommendation is the noise control bylaw number 915/2003, and that's to 11 p.m., which is an hour and a half past our 10 p.m. deadline, and that allows for the music portion of the festival for Yuki Days. And again, this is an annual recommendation. Unless we have major changes, I would use this as an annual recommendation.
Thank you. And these motions may be moved together.
I'll move that council authorize the closing of a portion of Fraser Lane between Main Street and Jamie's Welling Station from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. annually on the last Friday of July for Yuki Days activities. And that council authorize the temporary closure of Peninsula Road between Madison Road and Seaplane Base Road from 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. annually on the last Saturday of July for the Yuki Days parade. And further, that council to authorize Yuki Days festivities to act outside of the noise control bylaw number 915 2003 section 3G and grant an extension up to 11:30 p.m. at the Yuki Days Fairgrounds 160 Seaplane Base Road on the last Saturday of July annually for the Yuki Days event.
Thank you, Councillor Mafty.
I'll second it.
Councillor-
I need to guarantee that gumboot toss.
Councillor Hoare. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries.
That was the most soothing motion I've ever heard. It just drifted off.
Thank you.
A snake charmer.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson.
Oh my God.
Getting a little snappy.
The next two reports will be presented by the Chief Administrative Officer. The first item is 9.5 Ucluelethat Canoe Log. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we have a historic dugout canoe that is currently resides outside of the old Chamber of Commerce building. That is being repurposed to a daycare, and the owners of the lot have requested the municipality relocate it off of the private lot to an alternate location. Because this is a First Nations heritage artifact, we've reached out to the Ucluelethat government to determine, what would they like us to do with this, because it doesn't belong to the municipality. There was, as I understand it, a handshake deal, some sort of agreement between different parties of both communities to say, hey, we found this in the woods, can we put it in Ucluelet? And they said, sure. Now that process is more formal. There's a lot of work being done across the country to repatriate artifacts back to their heritage communities. So this also provides an opportunity for council to also look at helping to repatriate something that belongs back in Hitatsu with the Ucluelethat peoples. So we have reached out to staff counterparts. They've indicated that yes, they would love to see it be returned. They are ready to accept it on a couple of weeks' notice. We do have to do some work to ensure that the integrity of the artifact and the dugout canoe stays intact during the removal and movement process. We don't know what that looks like, and they've requested us investigate it with somebody that knows what they're talking about with an old tree, and determine how best to move it without damaging the structure or the integrity of the log. We've done kind of a brief estimate of what that might cost, and we're thinking in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $7,000. We can accommodate that within our operating budget. If we find out after investigation that it will cost more, then staff would recommend just coming back to council and saying this is what it's going to take, what would you like us to do. And the staff at Ucluelethat have indicated that they'd also like the fence, the wood fence that goes around it right now that gives some protection to it, and the sign to be accompany the log. Since the log would be removed back to Hitatsu, there's no real value in those for us, so I think it would be an indication, be okay to reallocate those back to make them as part of the package. We would, if council supports moving forward with this, then we would engage with the Ucluelethat government to make arrangements for the investigation of how best to move it. plan for that, and then assist with moving it over to Hatatsu.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. And the money that we need to spend on this can come out of the parks operations budget. Is that correct?
Parks and operations. We'll probably split it between the two somewhere in there, but I think we can find room within the total operations budget between parks and public works.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Gregg?
Not a question, more comment. I see the use of a sling system like they use when they're moving whales, because you need something that's going to support all the way along the log, or you'll lose structural integrity for sure. But I am all for repatriation, as that is one of those truth and reconciliation actions.
Great.
Can I just ask a quick question? Was there a request for the log back, or was it more from the Ucluelet side to say, well, this log is, the building isn't there anymore, do you guys want it back?
It was initiated because the landowner, which it currently resides on, it's not municipal property, and so the landowner has asked for it to be removed. And at that point in time, because it's a artifact, we're required to engage with the Ucluelet government. But it was also, well, this isn't ours, so we should definitely engage the First Nation government to see what they would like to have occur with that, whether it would stay in Ucluelet, been placed at a location that is desirable and supportable by themselves, or return to Hatatsu. They indicated back to staff that no, they want it back. They wanted it for a long time, and it's a very of significant cultural importance to them. They've also indicated that this is one of the best examples of a partially dug out canoe that they've ever seen. So it's of, as it was indicated to staff, of very high cultural importance and value to Hatatsu.
And there is a staff recommendation if someone would like to make a motion.
I've got this one. I will move that council authorize staff to work with the Ucluelet government on the return of the canoe log, including the existing signage and fencing, to Hatatsu.
Thank you, Councillor Hoare.
And I'll second that.
Councillor Anderson. Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries.
I like that log. It's very nice.
Can we take a 5-minute break? Would you like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion that we get a bio break.
Okay, second. Do I have a seconder?
Second.
Councillor Mafty. Any further discussion? All in favor? Okay, you can go. Carried.
When the system
Still seeing the clock.
There's a clock buttons.
I will just say that the best thing about that.
You're back.
Do you want to pull us back? I can put it in my report.
All right, we'll resume the meeting at 6:17. The next report is 9.6 UBCM Minister Meetings. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report is seeking direction from Council with respect to their desire to have meetings with ministers or staff, ministry staff at the annual UBCM meeting in September. Annually, there's a conference for municipal leaders and elected officials that happens in September. During those meetings, there's an opportunity to meet directly with ministers and ministry staff upon request and approval of the requests. These are usually opportunities for councils and communities to bring forward important issues, concerns, or even provide thanks to ministries for ongoing support or past support of projects, grant funding, etc., for individual communities. There is a deadline of June 30th for the request from municipalities to the ministries to request a meeting with specific ministers. In order to make those requests, staff need details of what council would like to discuss. We develop a prospectus on those meetings and then make that submission. So in order to do that, we need to know what council would like to talk to ministers about. This happens annually. Last year, we talked about a couple of issues, including BC Transit. We had a meeting with respect to grant fund or emergency management disaster relief funding for the damaged water line to Hitatsu that we received. There was also joint meetings with the ACRD on on the BC Transit and a couple other topics. I've included some samples of what those prospectuses look like to give council an idea of what we would prepare for submission to the ministry for those requests. So at this time, I'd like to leave it to council to advise if there's any meetings that you would like to request or any topics of specific concern or areas that you would like to address specifically with ministers. These meetings are typically 15 minutes. So you go in, you say hello, present your information, ask for whatever it is that you want, and minister usually says thank you very much, maybe provides a response, and then the meeting's over. So they are kind of a speed dating for ministries.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. And have we heard from the ACRD what meetings they are requesting?
Not at this time. There may be a request and likely a request with respect to transit. That would be the one that's of the forefront. They staff on the ACRD side, we're going to be engaging the board in the near future to determine any topics that they would like to make a request, but I haven't received any comments back other than possibly transit.
That would be one that we could participate with them on for sure. And I know the resort municipality mayors and CAOs want to discuss the RMI program with the Minister of Tourism. Is that right?
So with respect to the RMI program, all of the RMI communities do a joint request to the minister to have a meeting. Usually it's a lunch with CAOs and the mayors, at which time they have a discussion on the current issues and concerns and topics related to RMI. That's kind of a standing meeting and will be made, I believe, from the Golden will be taking the lead on arranging that and moving that initiative forward.
Thank you. Councillor Hoare, any issues that you would like to meet with the minister on?
So many things. But the speed date is That was a real revelation that first year. I haven't got one that's jumping out at me immediately. I mean, health is always one, but, you know, I'm not sure that we have a particular query for them. You know,
Okay. We have in the past met with the RCMP, just requesting additional coverage, especially in the summer months when half of them go on vacation. I don't know if that's something we want to keep asking for.
well, I know that, didn't we have that conversation with a little bit with the sergeant too about increasing? I mean, it can't hurt to add a voice each time, whatever little bit of pressure. Just saying.
Do any of the new councillors have anything they want to bring up? It's going to be a kind of a learning curve for you guys to witness this. Okay, Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, so I'm not totally sure about this. I talked to Cascadia earlier, but I wasn't able to get a hold of the president, Bill, and I met him a few times. I wanted to talk to him and see the potential, maybe talking to the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation, just on the basis that they're expanding right now with their seaweed program. It's in Tofino. It's in a few places. They have 15 farms on the coast now. So yeah, I wanted to just touch base with them first and see if there's some sort of partnership that we could do with them moving forward. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I just wanted to. We talked about that during strategy, and having some economic diversification and potentially an education program out here. And then the only other, but I'd have to circle back with you on that because I'm not sure how that falls in, and I want to talk to them because I know they interface with the ministry. I'm not sure which one, but I know that they have something that they do as well with the BC government. So I'll have to clarify that with them and come back to you. But the only other one was that I looked at was the Ministry of Health, as you were saying, and I kind of wanted to look at like the options for more like complex care and care for seniors moving down the road, and what we can do to maybe amp up some of the things that we could have done in town, as opposed to people going for appointments, and potentially have like a visiting rotations to doctors. I talked to UBC Medicine, and they were all for the idea of having where they come out for a week or something like that, and have the various disciplines. You could have like gerontology, oncology, whatever, and they come out and do a week here. So I wouldn't mind bouncing that off one of those ministers just to see what they think.
That would be Adrian Dix, probably, Minister of Health.
Right.
And it doesn't help that Island Health hasn't given us an announcement yet for our primary care unit, but it sounds like we're not quite ready to put a motion forward, Mr. Lawrence. So I know the deadline is June 30th, but maybe we can all do our respective homework and get back to you.
The only comment that I would have is that the next meeting of council is June 27th. So in order to prepare a meeting request for the ministries to consider, it has to be submitted by June 30th. So if there is topics that council or councillors would like to put forward, then I would request that maybe we can set up individual meetings and work through that request, which can be then reviewed on June 27th for submission immediately afterwards. If we can't get if it's the 27th, if I get a resolution from council, the likelihood that I can prepare the needed documents to make the requests is non-existent. So I kind of need some preliminary time, and that's why it's coming at this point to council, because we do need the ability to prepare those meeting requests. It's not huge, but it is important to have some of that background information to be able to prepare a request The other question is if this an item that within the strategic priorities is that we want to work on over the next several months and then prepare for a specific request and have a dialogue with the ministries at the next UBCM. It does delay it a year, but that doesn't mean that work can't occur. So it might be a more specific request that we can make for a discussion in preceding UBCM meetings, or if there's a specific idea as to what are we asking the minister at this point in time. Because these 15-minute meetings, they don't allow for a general discussion on possibilities or general topics. It's very, we would like to see this, or we understand this, can you do that? And I'm not sure if where we're at or where council is at with respect to kelp farming at this point in time, as an example. Healthwood might be a little easier because that's how can we make more care available, rotating care available within our community. It's a nice specific request that we can formulate a request to the minister at that they can focus on. So that one would be something that I could see that we could pull together for an immediate one. That kelp farming might be a little bit more tricky.
So,
Yeah, they used to never ask for all that information. You would just show up and talk to them. And then a few years back, they changed that format. So now they really want to know what you have on your mind. And so hence the briefing notes that they want ahead of time. So, yeah. Councillor Cunnington, you had something?
Yeah, just if it takes time to prepare these requests, is there anything that we unanimously agree on now so we can at least knock one of them off immediately, and so it's less work later when we come up with the other ones?
Yeah, I think we can pair up with ACRD for the transit
That's probably, yeah.
and let them maybe take the lead on that one. And Golden's taking the lead on the RMI. And so maybe the health one.
I think the health one's probably one we could all get behind, because that is increasing the amount of care out here is really important.
Okay, so we have a recommendation then. If someone would like to make a motion.
So we'll just do health for now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Mr. Rotenberg, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one thing. I believe the deadline for... Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the deadline for staff meetings is later in time.
Yeah, that is correct. There is a staff level meeting request that is August 30th, but the ones for the ministers is the deadline is June 30th. Typically, the council reaches out directly to the ministers at the elected official level, rather than the staff, unless there's something actionable. So the staff level is typically more action-based, project-based information, like operationally, and then the ministry is more higher level concept, service requests, increased funding, that type of thing.
Okay, so let's just maybe Councillor Anderson, you can make that recommendation, and we'll just stick to the Minister of Health.
Sure. I would move the council direct staff to prepare ministerial meeting request on the following topic for the 2023 Union of British Columbia Municipalities Conference: health care.
That'll work. Thank you.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Thank you.
I'm just thinking you might be able to pull some more information from Cascada or whatever that might be that could be a staff level sort of thing. Same with the post-secondary sort of idea too. There's like ideas that kick around on the, economic diversification ideas, right?
Yeah.
But they could be more staff level.
Mr. Lawrence?
If I may, if council if individual councillors or council as a whole has ideas of additional topics as we move forward, and actually if Councillor Anderson has a few minutes before he runs out on his holidays to discuss the topic of health, so I can formulate that request, just reach out to me and we can have a discussion on that. I can formulate a meeting request and bring it back to council for consideration by all of council to be an additional submission at the June 27th meeting. So there's still that opening here, but this does help move that forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any notices of motion? Seeing none, we have 2 correspondence items. The first one is the Ucluelet Racket Sport Club correspondence. Mr. Lawrence, is there anything we can do to help these guys spruce up the rec hall in any way, shape, or form? Because it's going to take some time before we get a hard sports facility, and they use this a lot for their pickleball.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes and no. It is within the purview of our Parks and Recreation Department, and they do ongoing maintenance to the facility. It is approaching 100 years. It is definitely at the end of its useful life. It has no foundation. It is part of the reason, or it is the reason why we're undertaking the development of terms of reference for the replacement of and creation of a new rec hall facility that would replace the Seaplane Base Road facility. So the more money we put into it to spruce it up, it could be very short-lived benefit. We anticipate, maybe, and this is, you never know with a building of this age, 3 to 5 years is really what we're looking at for the total life cycle of this building. We could throw a lot of money at this for very little gain in the useful life. So it's kind of a catch-22. How much money do you want to put into it? So I would say if we do have some money, although it's limited for it, that we're going in about $5,000 to $7,000 contract fees that we keep picking away at it, make sure it's safe and habitable. But unless if council wishes to do more, then that would be something to consider during the budgetary process, and we would need to evaluate what type of improvements, structural as well as physical or cosmetic, to upgrade that building. But the end result might be less desirable than anticipated because the life cycle of it is nearing its end, or at its end.
Yeah, I get that. And they're asking for 1 washroom, which is not possible because there's no sewage down there.
Correct.
I'm just thinking maybe if we can put a little bit of the maintenance budget in the fall into doing a little something down there, because this summer they will be playing tennis if they get their tennis court back. But, the pickleball is pretty popular.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Miss Fortune could organize that, or
we'll definitely reach out to the pickleball group, the Racket Sport Club group, and we can see what they're looking at, and Miss Fortune will undertake that. Like I said, there's only so much we can do with that age of the building without investing a tremendous amount of money for a building that is at the end of its life cycle.
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
I wondered if they were even aware that it wasn't on sewage, and that was the reason that the washrooms were.
I'm uncertain, but we will let them know.
Yeah, it feels like perhaps information passage back and forth would be good.
Thank you. The second item of correspondence is an invitation to attend How Local Government Can Support a Circular Economy webinar. This is put on by the Vancouver Island Coast Economic Developers Association. And I actually had to go to the agenda and click on this because it tells the date but not the time. So it's June 28th from 10 till 11:30. And I am in Port Alberni at an ACRD meeting that day. So I don't know if anybody else wants to attend it, but the link is in the agenda package.
I'd be interested, but I cannot.
Okay. We have 9 information items, and I will start with item 12.1, Ucluelet Government 2023 to 2027 members of the legislature for discussion. And I'd like to congratulate President McCarthy and the recently elected members of the legislature. Any discussion? Should we perhaps send a letter of congratulations? So that motion could be that council direct staff to write a letter of congratulations from the mayor to President McCarthy, well, from the mayor and council, let's say, to President McCarthy and the other members of the Ucluelet Government legislature. If I could get a seconder.
I'll second that.
Councillor Hoare, any further discussion? All in favor? None opposed, and that carries. Thank you. Item 12.2, Council Strategic Plan Priority Update for discussion. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Before Council is your strategic priorities overview dashboard. This, if Council recalls, they went through this strategic planning session. This is the report and overview that Council will be seeing on an ongoing basis, and which will be updated on a regularly as progress is made on Council's strategic priorities. Within the report is a sample resolution that Council could consider moving forward if priorities or when priorities change or new priorities come forward. There's a process that would be for council to gain support of fellow council members to add new priorities or change priorities. So that is a option for council at any time throughout the term and life cycle of the strategic priorities plan. You can see on the dashboard, I've already updated some of them. So we've resolved and completed the council code of conduct. We've replaced that with the recruitment of a new director of finance as a key priority. We've also took the liberty of adding in there the HALF program as a priority for the planning department. We had indications that would be a good one to do. So we've updated those to reflect the current priorities, and as you note on there, what happens is some of the other priorities get shifted down to make sure that there's the capacity for staff to undertake all the different priorities is recognized in the changes of priorities of council. In addition to this, I have developed an overview or sort of a I'm just bringing it open here. So we have the priority summary, which is just a one-pager, and then following that is the Council Strategic Priority Action Summary. So this is the latest action that we're taking in the step to meet the current priority and in the process. It will not be a running total of all the different steps that we're doing, just the current one, so council has an idea of where we're at and what the outcome is going to be. We've included a budget line in there to give council an indication of how much has been allocated to it. If it has a not applicable, it's because it's just administrative time. That is the focal point. And then the action date is generally the month of the year, the month that action will be completed. It is a living document. Everything changes on a fairly regular basis here, but it should give council an idea of how we're actioning their strategic priorities, as well as some of the strategic priorities that staff is working on. If council has any questions with respect to those and where we're at in progress, these quarterly reports would be a valuable time to ask those questions.
Thank you. There's just a typo in finance, Director of Finance Recruitment. But other than that, I love the report. It's fabulous, and it's great just to have it in front of us regularly to refresh our memories what we came up with at our strategic planning sessions. Any questions from council?
I've got a quick one. I'm just, we were talking about at the strategic planning session about the advocacy for Highway 4 cell phone coverage. And is that something that we want to bring up actually with the minister or with staff?
We have reached out to both TELUS and Rogers. So Rogers has indicated that this is the project on the list. So it's with the two large players to action. As we understand it, for the highway connectivity, they've just completed a major project on the South Island between Souk and Port Renfrew. Thank you. I always get the ports mixed up. And now that one is completed, they're moving on to the next one. So it's a very lengthy process because of the land title and work that needs to happen with the nations as well, because a lot of the towers have to be situated on traditional territories of First Nations communities. So they are working on that as we understand it. Rogers is taking the lead. TELUS is waiting for Rogers to do the implementation, and then it was our understanding that they will piggyback off of their towers and add their infrastructure onto the towers that Roger installs. So it is moving forward, although slowly.
Any other questions for Mr. Lawrence? No, thank you for that report. 12.3, resolution tracking. Mr. Rotenberg.
So as you all know, these are the resolutions that have action items directly associated with them. What we do is we track the resolutions, those items that have follow-up attached to them get placed on this tracker, and as we check them off, we identify them there. It's been quite some time since you guys have seen this resolution tracker, and I think we're back on track with it, no pun intended. So it includes everything, right? It includes everything from me photocopying something and getting it signed and then posting it on the internet to, one of my colleagues constructing a bridge. So all things big and small are on there, and we also use the resolution tracker as an archive. So if we're ever looking for ancient resolutions, for example, did council actually adopt that agenda? They're in there as well. I can strive to address any questions about specific items, but I'll have to pull it up on my computer.
Any questions for Mr. Rotenberg? I have a few myself. I see the Historical Society one has finally dropped off. Yay. Skate Park Lighting Project, research grant opportunities for Skate Park Lighting Project. It says it's complete, so I'm just wondering what the results of that research indicated.
I saw that.
Through the mayor, yes, I actually think that's a mistake. There was an error. There was the report that was done to council where the project was turned down, and then as we come across grants, we were going to further investigate as they came about. But there has not been any grants to date that meet that need, and it has dropped down on the priority list.
Oh, so it's just a wording issue.
Yes.
On that one. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I know that we did turn it down in the budget.
Yes, you did.
I just when I saw this, I thought, oh, the research for the grants has been completed, but that's not the case.
Not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
While you're still there, Miss Fortune, I
Yes.
actually had a question about this one too, and it was, did you look into like the community spaces grant that the co-op does? And
No, not at this time. It is something I can certainly look at. We were looking at that one potentially for the playground, but as you know, we were able to fund that one through RMI. So at this moment, no, it has not. It has not been further researched.
yeah, my guess was that there were two that sprang to my mind, and that was one, and the other
Yeah.
one was the BC Hydro one, because they have one for safety. So I thought we might be able to.
I will
do
certainly look
something.
into that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
And just while you're up there, Miss Fortune, it's not a question. I just looked at the motion for the Rotary Frisbee disc golf course, and I saw something from Rotary over the weekend that they installed the first 3 of their Frisbee golf course.
We have, through the mayor, we have our land use agreement with them, and they've been going full gangbusters and are very excited. So very positive.
Excellent. They sounded excited just on their email.
Yeah.
They were hoping everybody would go out and watch.
There was actually a very cool video of a barred owl. There was an owl that was sighted when they were doing the work up in the trees. It was quite lovely.
That owl lives there. It's in my backyard quite often.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Nice. And one last one for Miss Fortune, Amphitrite House. I understand there's some progress being made in that direction.
That's correct. Right. Well, actually, right now they're waiting for the other side of the island to come to us. So the intent was to start this week with putting up the fencing, and the hazmat team was going to be coming out on the 12th, but unfortunately, due to the current fire issue, that's a little bit on hold. So I'm sure they'll get that going as soon as possible.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I have one for Mr. Lawrence, the Pacific Rim Housing Development Corporation. Where are we at with them?
In my email and draft format. So actually, I have been trying to work on a report for council this week. I've been derailed by a fire, but we are working on a report to council on a response and seeking further direction from council.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Lawrence? Okay. There is an invitation to meet with BC Hydro during the UBCM conference, and it is in their annual report here that it talks about their grants program. So if you want to refer to that, we didn't get any this past year, but they, let's see, who did they give it to? Hornby Island, Strawberry Isle Marine Research, Nanaimo Area Land Trust, Salt Spring Elementary, Saanich Legacy Foundation. So it's on page 269 if you want to take a look at that. Do we want to meet with BC Hydro during UBCM?
Sure. do they offer socks?
No, that's Fortis.
That's no, Fortis offers socks.
Can we meet with Fortis?
There's new sock innovation. Remember, I got that little line last time.
Yeah, they're always at the trade show, and of course we don't have Fortis here on the West Coast, so you can't enter their draw for anything, but you can get their socks.
But in all seriousness, I thought about that when I saw the BC Hydro invitation. You know, they do a great job out here. I don't know if we really need to speak to them. Like if there's a topic that we need to actually engage with. But I mean, they have been like during power outages, they're outstandingly fast to address them. So it would probably be more me just giving them a compliment.
You can give them some socks.
They probably could use them on some of those nights.
When this 2022 annual report was sent out to us, it was like a month or two ago, I guess. I did reach out to Ted Olenek and ask if he wanted to be a delegation to us to present this report, because there's lots of really interesting information in there, but he didn't get back to me, so I'm assuming the answer is no. But we don't really need a meeting, I don't think, with him, but he may be at the trade show booth too.
Right.
Yeah. Did anyone attend the Legislative Reform Initiative at AVICC? Nobody attended that session. There were too many to choose from. I think Councillor Hoare and I did the amenities tour. That was really, really interesting.
So good.
And then we have the Pacific Aquaculture Transition, What We Heard report. Councillor Anderson, I know you sat in on 2 of those meetings. Is there anything, I guess you said the summary of what they've said here on page 293 is pretty accurate?
Right. Yep, I went through that summary. I think that first part there, that what we heard is not the aquaculture stuff, but different link. But yeah, the what we heard, it's a perfect summary of it was the 2 meetings that I went to, and yeah, I went through it, and it's basically exactly what was talked about. It was summarized. It was the idea, like local communities and the interests that people had in transitioning from net pen, and then there were also some on the other side of the fence that were pro farming. I reached out to DFO to ask if I could be help in any way. I was told no. They've got this, and I told them should they need my help, I will be available. Again, they said no.
Are you feeling rejected?
A little bit. I asked them if they had any socks.
We're back to
Fisheries
socks.
and Oceans doesn't have socks, but they do have toques.
Oh.
I could have made a sockeye joke there, but
A sock eye. Oh my god.
Oh,
Couldn't let it go by.
I just couldn't let it. I just couldn't. I'm a dad.
Totally
Oh,
punchy
shit.
now. I'm looking forward to these reports.
Oh my goodness.
I think we're getting to the end.
Yeah, I know the BC Salmon Farmers Association have been like blasting media. Like I think I get one a day from them, and I did.
Did you intentionally gloss over item 12.4, the United in Support for BC Salmon Farmers and Canadian Food Production?
No, I just pulled it back out again.
yeah.
Actually, this is what I'm looking at, and because they are doing a massive media campaign to try and talk the fisheries minister into not getting this transition happening faster than how they can manage it, I guess, is what they're doing. And I met with them at AVICC briefly at a lunch meeting. And yeah, they were looking for, and lots of mayors of coastal communities did sign a letter to Premier Eby about not fast forwarding this incentive. But of course, we don't have fish farms here in Ucluelet, so I didn't feel comfortable signing that letter on behalf of council. But I know a lot of coastal communities did sign the letter, kind of protesting the speed that they were implementing this at. So I didn't gloss over it.
Save the best for last.
Okay. We are at mayor's announcements and council committee reports. Of course, top of mind is the wildfire and the road closure. It kind of brings top of mind awareness of how vulnerable we are, having one road in and out of here. And I did just get a message at 5 o'clock from MLA Osborne. The detour route will be closed from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. tomorrow. This closure is necessary to remove a truck that was involved in a motor vehicle incident on Tuesday. So there is no detour route tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m., just to complicate things. Anyway, I did, I'll get to council reports here in a minute. The other thing I just wanted to mention, as under Mayor's reports, there's a really great art show happening at the Praz Orange Door Gallery. It's Marla Thirsk's 70th birthday, and it's her first ever solo show. So encouraging everyone to go down and see that at right downtown, right kitty corner to Yuki Dogs there. And the special, it's on all week, but there is a special event Saturday, June 10th from 10 to 3 with music, snacks, cake, and a piñata, apparently. So just wanted to make mention of that. And council reports. Councillor Anderson.
Not too much has happened. I had a ACHN, the Health Network meeting. It was so long ago that I don't totally remember. I have the agenda right in front of me, and I still can't totally remember it. But yeah, that was good. That was obviously Marcy was running that, and we talked about what we came up with for the big meeting in person that we did over at Hitachi, the previous meeting to that, where everyone met in person. And yeah, so other than that, it was their quarterly update, strategic plan update, and again, the summary from the April meeting that we had in person. Yeah, and then there was regional and member updates, and that was about it for that.
And that was your only meeting?
That was my only meeting, I think, yeah.
Great, thank you. Councillor Hoare.
I attended the Vancouver Island Regional Library Board meeting this past Saturday, and we got a lot of stuff done. But we were talking about some reconciliation actions at one point during the meeting, and Trustee Cote from the ACRD had this quote that was really good, so I'm throwing it out there because I love a good quote. We are doing the work, but we don't know the outcome. So that's the, make those reach outs, make those steps, have those conversations. You don't know what the final result will be, but if you don't make the steps, right? The other thing they're seeing some increase in library card usage, and one of the usages that I hadn't even thought about, but it suddenly, road closures have made it very important to me. So I read the Globe and Mail every week, and I like the physical paper. So I go and pick it up at the co-op. But sometimes the papers aren't there. So if you have a library card, you can access online newspapers. So you don't have to pay the incredibly high, for some of them, subscription rates. You can actually access them through the library. National Post, Globe and Mail, Vancouver Sun, so for a free library card, you can keep up on the news. Just a thought. So encouraging everybody to get a library card. What else is happening? I wanted to point out that little bio break allowed me to see a costume for the Glee show that is happening this weekend. So Friday night and Saturday night, doors open at 6, show is at 6:30. It is the West Coast Chronicles of Narnia, one of Courtney's mashups of all the Narnia books into one. Crazy show, I'm sure. I have not had any previews. Bring cash because I will be on the door and I don't have the ability to swipe your card, so you got to bring some cash. And there will be snacks available at the intermission, and the costume I saw was absolutely amazing. So little shout out to Gemma. I can't wait to see what you're doing in the play because she looked great. Maybe come and see the show and find out. Just saying. And the mayor already mentioned Marla's event on Saturday, so yeah.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will. The addition, putting my other worker's hat on. I will let you all know, the 20 bazillion listeners, watchers, that there is a produce truck coming out on Saturday. So don't worry that right now there isn't much lettuce and there's no cucumbers on the shelf. Resupplied as of Saturday.
Thank you. I did brave my way into the co-op last night because that's where we get pounced on. But I spoke to the general manager, Lori, and she assured me that the trucks were still coming. And she was watching people impulse buy all day and kind of going, really? But that's what people do. Anyway, the trucks are coming, except between 1 and 9 tomorrow. Thank you, Councillor Hoare. Councillor Kennington.
No committee reports, but I did just see that the Ministry of Transportation inspected the road at Cameron Lake, and there's no damage to the road. There's just a couple of trees, and they expect it's days, not weeks, to reopen. They just have to study the slope and make sure it's stable.
Great, thank you for that.
And apparently there was a co-op truck arrived at 3:30 this afternoon.
That's entirely possible. I left work at 3:20.
They're like, okay, she's gone.
Right?
Councillor Mafty.
I attended a meeting hosted by the Clayoquot Biosphere Trust with stakeholders, community partners, folks representing a whole bunch of different groups, soliciting input into what the next vital signs report should look like. I know the vital signs reports are, I find them quite useful and quite interesting, and I think that they're a great little snapshot of what's happening. And they're at the point right now where they're trying to figure out what the next one's going to look like, what they should focus on. So if anyone has thoughts, ideas, suggestions, concerns, I'm sure they'd love to hear from you as well. But only I got invited. And it was great.
Excellent. I love those vital sign reports.
Yeah, me too. They're really good.
Yeah. Okay, my meetings. May 10th, I was at the Barclay Community Forest Corporation meeting. And just a reminder that their AGM is June 29th at 10 a.m. here at the UCC. And I attended an ACRD meeting that afternoon, but there was really nothing to do with the West Coast. May 12th, I had a meeting with the district group. They are potential buyers of Monado Bay and just looking for ideas on what we would like to see there. So that was an interesting meeting. They spoke actually of if they are the buyers, they spoke of making it 100% rental, like monthly rent, like not nightly rental, but 100% rental for people. So that was really interesting. May 16th, we had our Harbour Authority meeting. May 17th, Mr. Lawrence and I had a Teams meeting with Island Health. We did ask about the primary care facility, and they are getting closer by the inch to determining who that is going to be. Who's going to be the winner of the RFP that they put out there. May 18th, I had a meeting with the new Executive Director of Tourism Tofino, Brad Parcell. That was really great to connect with him. May 24th, I had an ACRD meeting. Again, nothing really relevant to the West Coast. May 31st, a Zoom meeting with Watt Consulting. That's who the ACRD hired to look at alternative transportation methods on the West Coast. And that was with the Alberni Clayoquot Health Network Transportation Action Group. And so Watt Consulting gave a full report with their options available for a transportation group, for a transportation, well, anyway, I'll tell you about that in a minute. June 1st, had a Teams meeting with the resort municipal mayors. There were 9 of us. And it was an interesting conversation about the fact that destination marketing is now switching to destination management, because all the resort municipalities are really, they've been marketed to death and everybody knows where they are and how to get there. But to manage those visitors once they get here is the new thing that has to be dealt with. So that was a really interesting discussion. June 2nd, I had an iced tea meeting on Zoom. I think I've mentioned this several times, they were asking the government for $150 million to change the way they do things. They wanted to invest that money and spend only the interest. What they got was $10 million. And so they're going to continue doing what they've always done, is just look at projects one at a time and award money to the ones that they feel would benefit the most for economic development. June 7th was a West Coast Committee, and that's where the West Coast Committee chose the transportation company that is willing to offer transit service here on the West Coast starting in January. It's a temporary measure until BC Transit comes back to the table, but it will connect Tofino and Ucluelet and Itatsu. And that's somebody's car alarm going off.
No, that's in the building.
That's the building.
Oh,
This building?
Here, so it's good.
it is this building.
That's a door alarm for the building.
Maybe we should close that door.
I think no, we're all good. We can continue on. It's
Okay.
it's not a fire alarm or anything like that.
Okay.
Miss Fortune will deal with it.
Perfect. Also, at the West Coast Committee, it was recommended, the West Coast Committee makes recommendations to the ACRD is how it works. So there was an item on there recommending a memorandum of understanding between the Long Beach Airport and the Tloquet First Nation. So that will... So we should leave? Okay, motion to leave at 7:09. A recess at 7:09. I think it's fine.
Paddles.
Okay, you guys are live. Okay.
All right, we'll reconvene at 7:10. That was a 1-minute recess. But the alarms are off now, so that's all good.
I took care of it.
Nice. And also at the West Coast Committee, the West Coast Waste Management Regulations and Charges Amendment, they are changing the sort and go pickup starting at 7 a.m. now instead of 8 a.m. They decided they needed an extra bit of time. And they also changed their West Coast Landfill tipping fee bylaw amendment. Mattresses used to be $20, now they're $23. And they are taking mattresses and sending them to a social company in Port Alberni, and they have just celebrated recycling 30,000 mattresses in Port Alberni. And then the other thing that they're changing is cardboard. Used to be $200 per ton. It's now $350 per ton. So that was... Oh, and the other interesting thing about mattresses is the BC government is going to change it so that the mattress price will include the recycling fee. just like electronics are. When you buy your TV, you pay part of the prices to have it recycled. So they're going to do that with mattresses. That's really interesting. And lastly, this morning I had a Teams meeting with our MLA, Josie Osborne. There were a whole bunch of us on that meeting to talk about the fire and the road closure and what it meant. One of the interesting things, a pharmacist from Tofino mentioned that some of the pharmaceutical companies do not want to drive that detour road. So that could impact people's prescriptions, I guess. I don't know.
Madam Mayor, I happen to have an update on that.
Oh,
they are anticipating that those trucks will be arriving tomorrow.
Excellent. Good to know. Thank you. And that was it for my meetings. Any questions for me? All right, everyone's getting tired. Question period. This is an opportunity for the public to ask questions about matters within Council's jurisdiction. Representations about matters that have been the subject of a public hearing are not permitted at this time. Are there any questions from the audience? Mr. Rotenberg, are there any questions by Zoom or telephone?
We do not have any members of the public attending by Zoom or telephone.
And have we received any questions via email to communityinput@ucluelet.ca?
Not at this time.
Excellent. I'm now going to make a motion that the meeting be closed to the public in order to address agenda items under Section 90, brackets 1, brackets A, and brackets C of the Community Charter. These matters relate to personal information about an identifiable individual who is being considered for a position appointed by the municipality and labor relations or other employee relations. Could I have a seconder?
Second.
Councillor Mafty? All in favor? None opposed? That carries. This meeting is now closed to the public at 7:14.